The last thing he remembered was the headlights of an oncoming car and the sound of a crash. He woke up in a field of charred bones and melted metal beneath a dead gray sky. And the blue screen in front of him congratulated him on his new class. Scavenger. And this is where the strangest part begins. Dan Kai sits up and coughs up ash. A field of dead things stretches all the way to the horizon. Bones the size of his hand. Melted metal. Shards of armor. This isn't a junkyard. A junkyard has a fence and a gate. This is just a field. He reads the screen again. Scavenger. Class assigned. Congratulations. He wants to laugh, but his throat is clogged with dust. A shadow looms over him. A skinny boy of about 12 in a tattered jacket is holding a wooden wheelbarrow and looking down at him. Not with surprise, with irritation, as if Dan had taken his job. The boy growls that the site needs to be cleared and that the dump boss doesn't pay for downtime. Dan doesn't hear him. He stares intently at the horizon. Rusty spires stick out of the ground like broken teeth. Behind them, concrete walls glow dimly, and beyond that, a forest. Only these aren't trees, they're bones, huge white bones, taller than a 5-story building, stick out of the ground like tree trunks. And right then, something strange happens to Dan. Instead of panic, he feels a sense of familiarity. The last time his breath caught like this was when he was 12, when he walked into his grandfather's garage and saw a disassembled motorcycle. Not out of fear, out of awe, out of the sheer number of things that could be touch, understand, and put back together. Dan stands up. His legs feel unsteady, the body is unfamiliar, the fingers are longer than he's used to, but there are old calluses on the palms. The person he's inhabiting also worked with his hands. That's good. The boy is still waiting. Dan looks at him and says one word. Okay. Then he adds that there's so much untouched material here it makes his head spin. The boy twirls his finger at his temple, mutters that psychos from the ruins are his curse, and pushes the cart further. The wheel creaks with every turn, and Dan reads it mechanically. The axle is bent, play to the right. The kid is using a third more strength than necessary. It's not a thought, it's a habit. For 8 years at the scrap metal processing plant in Pittsburgh, he looked at broken things and saw not trash, but numbers. Weight, composition, residual strength. Dan grabs the first scrap, a bent piece of metal with a jagged edge. The screen flashes. A blade fragment, low-carbon steel, strength, 14%. Traces of a third-order enchantment, recommendation, remelt. To the locals, it's trash, a broken sword. To Dan, it's a passport. He sees the steel grade. He sees that the enchantment was applied crookedly and rotted away 3 times faster than expected. He sees that 2 high-strength bolts can be extracted from this piece. 2 bolts aren't much, but 2 bolts are a start. He picks up a bone, a second-rank broken tibia, 1.5 times denser than steel. He sets it aside. He grabs some copper wire with a clean cross-section, then a cloudy, cracked crystal. The screen calls it an depleted core with a 2% charge. For a hunter, it's a dud. For Dan, 2% is enough to power the circuit for 6 hours. He rummages through the debris all day. No one pays him any mind. Around him, other scavengers drag wheelbarrows and shovel everything into a single pile. No one sorts it. No one checks the material. They haul their haul to the pits and set it on fire. Dan freezes and watches as the pile burns, a pile in which he counted 200 kilograms of usable metal in a minute. It physically hurts, as if someone were throwing a working engine into a furnace because they don't know it's an engine. By evening, Dan has his own pile, small, sorted by type, metal separate, bones separate, crystals by themselves. The cleaners give him dirty looks. One asks what he's doing. Dan replies that he's sorting. The man doesn't understand the word. Dan explains. The cleaner shrugs and says they'll burn it all anyway tomorrow, so what's the difference? Dan doesn't argue. There's nowhere to sleep. He lies down right on the ashes. It's cold. His body is thin and gets cold quickly. He looks up at the gray sky and thinks that it's Friday in Pittsburgh now. His shift is over, and he should be heading home. But there is no home anymore, and there is no Pittsburgh, and there is no longer the person he used to be. There is only ash, cold, and the word scavenger. Tomorrow he will find tools. A stone and a stick are already tools. The day after tomorrow he'll gather something simple and useful. He doesn't know this world, but he knows one thing. Everything he needs lies among the trash. You just have to look in the right way. The second morning begins with rain. The ashes under his feet spread out like gray porridge. Dan isn't looking for materials. Tools. Cutting tools. striking tools, gripping tools. In 2 hours, he finds a shard of a blade with a surviving edge, a stone of the right weight, 2 pieces of rebar for pliers. Rough, but it'll do. He squeezes into a corner between 2 collapsed walls. It's dry. There's no wind. The place is a no man's land because no one sees any value in it. Dan does. The 2 walls are the foundation. He'll finish the third with bone beams, a roof of sheet metal. He sharpens the blade fragment on the stone for 40 minutes. He saws the bone with this cutter. It's denser than any wood. It's slow going. But bone is strong and light. The perfect material that the whole world considers waste. By noon, he has the frame of a workbench. 4 bone legs, a metal plate on top. Rough but sturdy. Without a workbench, you're a cripple. With a workbench, you're a master. On the third day, that same boy with the wheelbarrow shows up. He stands at the edge of the shelter and says nothing. His face is red, his eyes are wet, but he isn't crying. He's been taught not to cry out loud. Dan asks what's wrong. The boy's name is Theo. The wheelbarrow's axle broke. The dump boss told him to fix it himself or find another job. And there isn't another one. Without a job, they'll kick him out of the barracks. And then he'll be sleeping at the dump like Dan. Theo isn't asking for help. He's just saying it out loud to convince himself that it's all real. Dan stares at the wheelbarrow for 3 minutes. The axle is bent in 2 places. The wheel seizes up every third rotation. There's no bearing. They don't know what a bearing is here. The wheel is grinding bare metal against metal. Dan tells him to wait. He goes to the dump and comes back with 3 things. A bone from the middle of the broken one. A piece of spring with a drift. Copper wire from an old lamp. Theo watches. Dan whittles the bone into a cylinder. He soaks it in oil from a crushed lantern. The bone absorbs the oil and becomes slippery, harder than steel, but lighter. He straightens the spring by hitting it with a stone. He adjusts it to the right length, ties it with copper wire. A new axle, made of bone. 1.5 times stronger than iron, half as heavy, impregnated with oil to reduce friction. He installs the axle, secures the wheel, gives it a turn. The wheel spins freely, quietly, without a single squeak. Theo doesn't move. Then he reaches out and pushes the wheelbarrow. It rolls, easily, like clockwork. Theo lifts his head. In his eyes is what Dan has seen before. That's how people look when they're given back something they thought was lost forever. Dan tells him to go to work and not tell anyone who fixed it. Theo nods and pushes the wheelbarrow. For the first time in 2 years, it doesn't squeak. By evening, there's a line at Dan's shelter. 4 janitors. One has a broken scraper. The second has a cracked wheelbarrow handle. The third is walking barefoot on hot ash because the straps on his boots have snapped. The fourth just heard about it from Theo and came to watch. Dan fixes the scraper in 15 minutes, the handle in 20, the boots in 30, in silence. The street cleaners don't understand what he's doing. He takes 2 pieces of trash, and half an hour later, one becomes a part and the other a tool. To them, it's a magic trick. To Dan, it's just a regular job. The same as in Pittsburgh, only the materials are different. The fourth guy asks how much Dan charges. Dan says nothing. The guy doesn't believe him. He asks again. Dan repeats, nothing. The janitor walks away, confused. That night, Theo returns. He brings a pillow and a blanket from the barracks. He puts them in Dan's shelter. He says he's sleeping here tonight and that Dan should take his bunk. Dan refuses. Theo lies, saying people are snoring in the barracks and he can't sleep anyway. They both know it's a lie. But Dan doesn't argue. He takes the blanket and goes to the barracks. The first night in 3 days, not on the ashes. The bunk smells of sweat and cheap soap and is as hard as a board. Dan falls asleep in 30 seconds. He dreams of his grandfather's garage and a dismantled motorcycle and the sun shining through a dusty window. And his grandfather's voice. Don't rush. First, look at everything. Then decide where you're going. Then get started. The 4th day began with the landfill boss coming in person. His name was Goran, a broad man with a red face and stubby fingers. He stood in front of Dan's shelter and looked at the workbench and the neat piles of sorted materials. Then he looked at Dan. He asked who he was. Dan replied that he was a scavenger. Goran said that scavenger wasn't a profession but an insult, and that you couldn't live at his dump without permission, and that all the material at the dump belongs to the enclave and cannot be taken. Dan asked why the enclave needs material that they burn. Goran opened his mouth and closed it. Then he said that rules are rules. Dan proposed a deal. He would repair the cleaner's tools for free. In return, he would be allowed to live in the shelter and take whatever was meant for burning from the dump. Goran thought for about 10 seconds. Then he said that Dan would also have to repair his personal belongings. Dan agreed. Goran left. In an hour, he returned with a leather belt whose buckle had broken. Dan fixed the buckle in 10 minutes. Goran twirled the belt in his hands. The buckle worked better than a new one. He grunted and left without saying a word. But no one else touched Dan's shelter. The first week was spent studying. Dan walked through the junkyard every day from dawn to dusk. He picked up objects. He scanned them with the interface, memorized them. In 7 days, he analyzed more than 300 objects. Shards of swords, pieces of armor, gears from mechanisms he didn't yet understand, bones of creatures of various sizes and densities, crystals with residual energy, wires, tubes, plates with runes. Every item told a story. Here was a blade forged with care, but enchanted cheaply, and it didn't hold up in its first real battle. Here was a breastplate with a crack along the shoulder line. Whoever wore it likely died because the crack went unnoticed. Here was a gear from an ancient machine, an alloy Dan had never seen before. The interface identified it as arcanite bronze. Its strength was 3 times that of ordinary steel. Its magical conductivity was high. From a single gear like this, one could make 15 bolts capable of withstanding a load of 1 ton each. And this gear was lying in a pile destined for the fire. Dan took it and carried it to the hideout. By the end of the first week, his stockpile looked modest, but was growing steadily. 20 kilograms of various grades of metal, 10 steel blanks, turned and oiled, 3 spent projectiles with remnants of their charges, a spool of copper wire, a spool of steel wire, a set of plates with runes that he didn't understand yet but planned to study. Theo came every evening. He sat down next to the workbench and watched Dan work. He didn't ask any questions. He just watched. On the 5th day, Dan gave him a task. He told him to bring 3 bones of the same size. Theo brought 5. 3 were identical, 2 were not. Dan showed him the difference. He explained that it wasn't just the length that mattered, but also the density and texture. Theo listened intently. He nodded. The next day, he brought exactly 3, perfectly matched. Dan smiled for the first time since the transfer. On the 8th day, the system proposed the first blueprint. The interface flashed and displayed a diagram before Dan's eyes. A mechanical trap, a spring-loaded trap, components, a bone frame, a steel spring, a copper trigger mechanism, a depleted first-rank core for activation. The blueprint was detailed, with tolerances, with load specifications, with step-by-step assembly instructions. Dan read it and felt right at home. This was engineering, pure engineering. Just magical circuits instead of electrical ones, bone gaskets instead of rubber seals, a core instead of a battery. But the principle was the same: energy, mechanism, result. He spent 2 days assembling the trap, not because it was difficult, because he was working without proper tools. He had to shape every part by hand using a blade fragment and a stone. He made the spring from a strip of steel. He heated it over a fire. He coiled it. He hardened it in oil. Primitive, but the physics are the same whether in Pittsburgh or here. Steel is steel. Temperature is temperature. Carbon is carbon. On the 10th day, the trap was ready. A bone frame the size of a dining table. Steel jaws with serrations made from sharpened bone spikes. A tension spring capable of snapping shut with enough force to break a log as thick as an arm. A trigger mechanism with a copper tension rod. And at the center, a depleted core which, when activated, emitted a brief burst of energy. This burst amplified the snap for a fraction of a second. The difference between an ordinary trap and a magical one. An ordinary one breaks a leg. This one severs it. Theo helped him carry the trap beyond the dump's perimeter. There was a path there, a narrow strip of trampled earth between the dump and the wastelands. The broken walked along it at night. The small ones, 1st and 2nd rank. They came to the dump because they sensed the remnants of magical energy in the trash, like rats to the smell of food. The cleaners were afraid of them. Sometimes a creature would wander into the dump and maim someone. Goran would file a complaint with the guild. The guild would send a hunter a week later. By then, the creature was already gone. Dan set the trap on the path. He camouflaged it with ashes. He stretched the snare across it. He returned to his hiding place. On the morning of the 11th day, Theo woke him up. The boy was shaking. Not from fear, from excitement. The creature was lying on the trail, a 2nd-rank broken one, the size of a large dog, a body of twisted metal and flesh, 4 legs, a tail made of steel segments, a head without eyes, a mouth full of teeth made of something resembling obsidian. The trap had worked perfectly. The jaws had cut the creature in half. Clean. Exactly. Dan stood and looked at the dead broken one. The interface was already running an analysis. Skeleton made of magically modified steel. High density, muscle tissue made of an organometallic alloy. Average strength, low magical conductivity, second rank core, fully charged, ready for use. Dan pulled out the core, a small crystal the size of a walnut, dark blue, warm to the touch. Energy pulsed within it, not 2% like in the depleted scraps from the dump. Fully charged. He looked at the core and understood. For a hunter, this is a day's work. The hunter kills the creature, takes the core, brings it to the guild, gets paid. For Dan, it was something more. It was a full-fledged energy source. With it, he could power a device that runs not for 6 hours but for 6 months. With it, he could build something serious. He returned to the trail that same evening. He moved the trap 20 meters further. He changed the direction of the snare. The next morning, another creature lay in it. First rank, smaller, weaker, but the core was intact. 2 cores in 2 days. No fight, no weapons, no hunting skills. Just mechanics and knowledge of how a creature looking for food thinks. Theo asked how Dan knew where to set the trap. Dan replied that rats follow the same trails. It's the same here. Tracks on the ground, scratches on the rocks, traces of slime. If you know how to look, the creature itself shows where it will be tomorrow. Theo listened and memorized. On the 12th day, Dan began dissecting the first broken he'd caught. It took the whole day. He laid the creature on the workbench and carefully separated it into components. A steel skeleton, organometallic muscle tissue, obsidian teeth, segmented tail, articulated joints. The interface described each element. Dan read and memorized. The creature's joints were ingeniously designed. A ball and socket joint with 3 degrees of freedom. No engineer in Pittsburgh could have done better. The tissue between the metal and the flesh functioned as a servo motor. It contracted from a magical impulse and moved the limb. Primitive in concept, flawless in execution. Dan took the creature apart down to the last fragment. He sorted the pieces. He labeled each element with charcoal on bone tablets. Theo sat nearby and looked at the neat rows of parts that an hour ago had been a monster. He said he was scared. Dan asked why. Theo replied that he used to think the creature was just a creature, alive and terrifying. But now he saw that the creature was just a collection of parts. And if the creature was a collection of parts, then what was a human? Dan paused. He looked at the boy. 12 years old, works at the dump, sleeps in a shack, and asking questions Dan has no answer for. Dan said that a human is someone who decides what to do with the parts. A creature didn't choose to be a creature, but Theo chooses every day. Theo thought for a moment and said that sounded like something church priests say, only without the pomp. Dan smiled. The end of the second week. Dan had his tools, a stockpile of materials, 2 cores, knowledge of the inner workings of the broken, a working trap, one apprentice who didn't yet know he was an apprentice. There was no roof over his head. There was no protection. There wasn't a single ally except for a 12-year-old janitor, and the entire Hornvale enclave had no idea that living in its dump was a man who saw the world differently from everyone else. The start of the 3rd week brought the first real problem. Dan woke up to the noise, voices, shouts. He emerged from his hiding place and saw a crowd of scavengers at the northern edge of the dump. Goran was there, yelling at someone. Dan moved closer and saw it. A 3rd rank broken, the size of a horse, standing right on the dump. Amidst the piles of trash, it wasn't moving, just standing there, turning its eyeless head from side to side, as if sniffing the air. The scavengers were backing away slowly. Theo was among them, pale. He was holding the wheelbarrow close to him like a shield. Goran was shouting that they needed to call the hunters. One of the cleaners ran toward the city gates. Dan looked at the creature. The interface ran an analysis. A 3rd rank broken. Scout type. A frame made of reinforced magical steel. High-density muscle tissue. 6 limbs. A sensor array in the skull plate. 3rd rank core. The creature wasn't here by accident. It had been drawn by the scent of the cores Dan had extracted from the monsters he'd captured. He'd been keeping them out in the open in his hideout. He hadn't considered that the scent of magical energy would attract something bigger. Mistake. A stupid mistake. The creature took a step. The cleaners backed away. Goran grabbed a shovel. Dan knew that a shovel against a broken 3rd rank creature was like a toothpick against a bear. If the creature attacked, someone would die. Maybe Theo, maybe Goran, maybe one of the 4 cleaners who came to him to fix tools. Dan ran for cover, grabbed both cores, ran back out. The creature turned its head toward him. It sensed him. He stepped away from the crowd, stood in the open, alone, with 2 cores in his hands. The creature was looking at him. Or rather, it wasn't looking. It had no eyes. But the sensor array in its skull plate was aimed directly at Dan, at his hands, at the cores. The creature took a step toward him, then another. Dan backed away, slowly, leading the creature away from the people, toward the trail, toward the spot where his trap stood. A second-tier trap. It wouldn't work against a third-tier one. It wouldn't be powerful enough. But Dan didn't need to kill the creature. He needed to buy time. He reached the trail. The creature followed him. Not quickly. It was cautious. A scout. Doesn't rush into battle. Studies. Dan placed 1 core on the ground next to the trap. He stepped back with the second. The creature stopped. Its sensor array darted between the 2 sources, the core on the ground and the core in Dan's hand. It chose the closer one. It stepped toward the trap. Dan waited. The creature stepped on the tripwire. The jaws snapped shut. Steel teeth sank into its forelimb. They didn't sever it. Third rank. The skeleton was too sturdy. But the creature jerked, lost its balance, fell onto its side. The trap held it by the leg. The creature began to tear at the snare. Dan had 30 seconds, maybe 40. He didn't count. He ran back toward the dump, not to the shelter, to the incineration pit. There, at the edge, lay a canister of flammable liquid that the cleaners used to set the trash on fire. He grabbed the canister, ran back. The creature had almost broken free. The trap was creaking. Dan poured the contents of the canister over the creature, 5 liters of oily, flammable mixture. Then he grabbed a rock and a piece of scrap metal. He struck. Once. Twice. On the 3rd strike, a spark flew. The flame flared up instantly. The creature caught fire. It didn't scream. The broken have no voice. But it began to thrash. The trap finally gave way and shattered. The creature rose, burning. The metal of its frame was red hot. The organometallic tissue was melting. The creature ran, not toward Dan, away, into the wasteland. The burning silhouette receded and grew smaller and smaller. A minute later, it fell. 3 minutes later, it stopped moving. Dan stood on the trail. His hands were shaking, his knees too. The adrenaline was fading, leaving a void in its wake. He'd nearly died. He'd nearly died because of his own stupidity. He'd kept the cores out in the open. He hadn't thought about the smell. He hadn't bothered with protection. An engineer who hadn't accounted for the variable. At the factory, they'd fire you for that. Here, you die for it. He returned to the creature's carcass. It was still smoldering. The interface was working. A 3rd-rank core. Damaged. Charge, 47%. Serviceable with limitations. Dan pulled out the core. It was hot. Larger than the previous ones. The size of an apple. Even damaged and with half a charge, it was worth more than anything he'd ever had. When he returned to the dump, the cleaners looked at him in silence. Goran stood with a shovel in his hands and his mouth agape. Theo rushed toward him, grabbed his arm. Theo's hand was ice cold. The boy was shaking harder than Dan. Dan told him everything was fine. Theo said it wasn't fine, that Dan was crazy, that he could have died. Dan didn't argue because Theo was right. Goran walked over. He looked at the core in Dan's hand, then at the charred remains of the trap, then at Dan. And for the first time in 2 weeks, he called him by name. He said that Dan was either a genius or an idiot, and that he hadn't decided which yet. Then he left. That day changed 2 things. First, Dan realized he needed protection. Not someday. Now. He wasn't a fighter. He'll never be a fighter. He survived against a 3rd-rank broken only because the creature was cautious. If it had attacked right away, he'd be dead. He needs someone between him and the monsters. Second, the cleaners started to fear him. Not with hostility, with respect. They saw how a man without weapons or magic lured out a 3rd-rank creature and burned it with a can of fuel in a homemade trap. To them, it was impossible. To Dan, it was improvisation on the verge of panic. But they didn't know that. Dan spent the next 3 days working. He was building. Not weapons. Protection. First, he assembled a container for the cores. airtight, made of bone plates with a layer of clay in between. The clay dampened the magical radiation. He checked. He held a shard of a crystal detector up to the container. Not a trace of a leak. No more creatures would be able to smell their way in. Then he began building a wall, not around the entire dump, around his shelter. Bone beams dug into the ground, metal sheets between them, wire on top of it all. A wall 2 meters high. It wouldn't stop a serious creature, but it would slow it down, buy some time. Theo helped, carried materials, handed him tools, held the beams while Dan secured them. The boy didn't ask questions. He just worked. On the 4th day after the incident, someone new came to the shelter. A woman, short, in light leather armor, 2 short blades on her back, a hooded cloak. The hood was down. Her face was stern, sharp cheekbones, dark eyes, attentive. She stood by the wall and looked at the workbench and the rows of sorted materials and the bone container for projectiles. Then she looked at Dan. She said her name was Han So-yoon, a hunter, rank B. She said she'd heard from one of the cleaners that a man who repairs things lives at the dump. Dan said it was true. So-yoon took one of the blades from behind her back and placed it on the workbench. The blade was cracked. A deep crack ran from the middle of the blade almost to the guard. One more fight and it would snap in half. She said she needed to have it repaired and that she would pay. And she added that he shouldn't try to be nice. Dan took the blade. The interface returned the analysis. High carbon steel, professional tempering, 4th order enchantment. Enchantment degradation at 60%. Crack along the line of maximum stress. Cause: a micro defect from forging, exacerbated by repeated impact. Prognosis: failure upon the next critical load. But this wasn't just a blade. Dan saw deeper. He saw the old metal. He saw that this blade had been reforged at least twice. He saw traces of the original rune on the blade's surface. The rune had been almost completely worn away, but microscopic traces remained. Someone had once inscribed a personal rune on this blade, a family rune. Dan looked up at So-yoon. He asked whose blade it was. So-yoon replied that it was hers. Dan said he could see an old rune beneath the reforged layer and asked whose it had been before her. So-yoon was silent for 3 seconds. Then she said it had belonged to her father. Dan nodded. He placed the blade back on the workbench. He said the repair would take a week, but that he wouldn't be repairing it, he would be remaking it. So-yoon frowned. She asked what that meant. Dan explained, "You can't just weld the crack shut. The metal is fatigued. The enchantment has degraded. If you just patch it up, the blade will break in a month." The only right way was to remelt it, completely, down to the core, with a new tempering and a new enchantment, but preserving the original alloy, and restoring the rune. So-yoon said that not a single blacksmith in Hornvale had taken on the job. They all told her to throw it away. Dan replied that he wasn't a blacksmith. So-yoon asked who he was then. Dan thought for a second. Then he said he was the one who doesn't throw things away. So-yoon looked at him for a long time. Then she asked how much. Dan named his price. Not money. He didn't need money. He needed access to materials from the hunt, bones of the highest creatures, shards of weapons from the wasteland. Everything that hunters usually discard after a battle because they don't consider it valuable. So-yoon said it was a strange price. Dan said he was a strange craftsman. So-yoon placed the second blade next to the first. She said both had belonged to her father, and both were cracked. Dan examined the second one. Same problem, same defect, same traces of the family rune. He said he would reforge both. So-yoon nodded. She turned and walked toward the city gates. She stopped halfway. She turned back and said that if he ruined her father's blades, she wouldn't return as a customer. Dan didn't answer. He was already examining the crack through the interface and calculating the remelting temperature. Remaking the blades took not a week, but 10 days. Dan wasn't in a hurry. He couldn't be in a hurry. He didn't have a forge. He didn't have an anvil. He didn't have any of the things a normal blacksmith would consider the bare minimum. But he did have a mind filled with 8 years of factory experience and an interface that showed the structure of metal down to the molecular level. For the first 2 days, he built a furnace. From fire bricks he found in the ruins of an old building on the edge of the dump. From bone beams for the frame. From clay to seal the joints. He assembled the bellows from a leather bag and 2 wooden frames. Primitive, but it was building up heat. The interface showed 900 degrees, with the bellows running at full capacity. Not enough for high-quality steel. He needed at least 1200. Dan added bone dust to the fuel. The bones of the broken released magical energy when burned. This energy raised the temperature. With the bone dust, the furnace reached 1,300 degrees. Enough. On the third day, he began to take the blades apart, carefully. He removed the hilts, unscrewed the guards, he separated the pommels. He placed each part separately. Then he turned his attention to the blades. The interface showed that the steel of both blades was identical. One master, one smelting. Father So-yoon had ordered them as a pair. The rune on each was the same, the family crest of the Han clan. Almost worn away, but Dan saw it. He saw every stroke, every line. The system memorized the pattern and saved it as a template. He remelted both blades. It was terrifying. Two pieces of steel that a man had forged 20 years ago for his daughter, and Dan threw them into the fire. But there was no other way. Worn-out metal cannot be repaired. It can only be reborn. The molten steel flowed into a mold that Dan had carved from a block of bone. The mold was river-like. He recalculated the blade's geometry, removed the weak spots, shifted the line of stress, added a fuller, a shallow groove along the blade's plane. It reduced weight without sacrificing strength. Earthly technology. No one in this world used it. But the main thing came next. Dan had a bone, one specific bone. He found it on the fourth day at the dump, a fragment of a skull plate from a broken fourth rank, a rarity. 4 times denser than steel, maximum magical conductivity. Such bones were worth a fortune. This one lay in the pile for burning because it was, and no one knew what to do with it. Dan knew. He ground the bone into dust, mixed it with molten steel. He created an alloy that didn't yet exist in this world, steel with bone filler. Lightweight, durable, and a conductor of magic. A blade made of ordinary steel can be enchanted. The enchantment will sit on top like paint on a wall. Over time, it will wear off. A blade made of bone alloy doesn't need to be enchanted on the outside. The magic is within it, in its structure, in its crystal lattice. It won't wear off because it is part of the metal. The 2 new blades cooled in their molds for 2 days. Dan didn't remove them before the time was up. Patience. There is nothing more foolish than ruining work through haste. On the 6th day, he began assembly. He recovered the old hilts with new leather. He polished the guards and reinforced them with thin inserts made of the same bone steel. He left the pommels as they were. They were in good condition, and So-yoon was used to their weight. There was no need to change the balance. And on each guard, he engraved the Han family crest. Using a template that the interface had saved, line by line, stroke by stroke, and inside the hilt, on a metal plate hidden beneath the wrapping, he restored the inscription, his father's inscription. It had been on the inside of the original plate. Microscopic traces, almost invisible. The interface had read them. So-yoon, come back alive. Dan engraved these words on the new plate, in the same handwriting, the same size. He hid them under the wrapping. She would never see them unless she took the handle apart. But they would be there, just as they had been for 20 years. Theo watched the process every evening. On the 7th day, he asked why Dan was trying so hard, if it was just an order. Dan replied that there was no such thing as just a commission. There is an object and there is the person for whom it is made. If you don't see the person behind the object, then you're not a master. You're a machine. Theo pondered this for the rest of the evening. On the 10th day, So-yoon came for the blades. She stood at the workbench and looked at them. 2 blades on a clean cloth. The blades were slightly darker than they had been, with a barely noticeable bluish tint. It was the color of bone steel. So-yoon took the blade on the right. She lifted it. She turned it. The blade flashed. She made a short test swing. Stopped. Made another one. Then she looked at Dan. She said the balance was different. Better. She said the blade was lighter but felt denser in her hand. She asked what he had done. Dan explained briefly. A new alloy. Different geometry. Holes to reduce weight. Magic in the structure, not on the surface. So-yoon picked up the left blade. She checked both. She looked at the guards. She saw the family pattern. Her fingers rested on the engraving. She traced the lines with her fingertip, slowly, like a blind person reading text. Then she looked at Dan. Her eyes were dry. Her voice was steady. She asked how he recognized the pattern. Dan said the markings were on the old blades. The system had counted them. So-yoon nodded. She sheathed the blades. She stood there for a second. Then she said the supplies from the hunt would be ready tomorrow. She turned and walked away, at a brisk pace, without looking back. Theo said she was strange. Dan said she wasn't strange. She didn't want anyone to see her face right now. Theo didn't understand. Dan didn't explain. The next day, 3 bags were standing at the dump gate. Bones, weapon fragments, pieces of armor, all from the last hunt. A note lay on the bags. One word: thank you. Dan took the bags. He sorted through the contents in 4 hours. 26 usable items. 5 high-quality bone blanks. 3 weapon fragments with traces of enchantment. 1 servo motor fragment from an ancient machine. The last item made him freeze. A servo motor. Not from the broken. From a machine. A real machine. An ancient one. The interface ran an analysis. A magic-powered servo motor. Origin manufacturer unknown. Pre-fracture era. Arcane bronze alloy. Operational condition. Residual charge. Mechanism fully functional when connected to a power source. Dan held the servo in his hands, unable to believe it. A working mechanism. From the time before the fracture. 12 years ago, someone created this and then discarded it. Or lost it in battle. Or tossed it aside as scrap. And now it lay in a sack with bones and rusty iron. Dan carried it to the workbench. He took it apart. Not completely. Just the outer casing. Inside, it was clean. Arcanite bronze doesn't rust. The gears were intact. The magical circuit was intact. The only thing missing was energy. He connected a depleted first-rank core. 2% charge. The servo motor came to life. The gears turned. Quietly. Smoothly. Without a single jam. Dan looked at the working mechanism and saw the future. Not an abstract one. A concrete one. With blueprints and tolerances. 1 servo motor is an arm. 2 are arms and legs. 4 is a whole body. A body that moves on its own. A body that can be assembled from bones and metal and made to walk and work and defend. A golem. The word came on its own, not from the interface, from his head, from the books he read as a child. A clay giant, a protector, a servant. But not made of clay, of steel and bone and magic and engineering calculations. The golem was a long way off, years of work, hundreds of components, dozens of blueprints. But the path began with a single working servo motor in the hands of a scavenger at a dump outside the city walls who didn't know his name. Dan put the servo motor in a container, closed it, took out a bone tablet and wrote a single word with charcoal. 1. Theo asked what it meant. Dan said it was a name. Theo asked whose. Dan replied that it belonged to no one yet, but someday he would understand. That evening, So-Yun came, not with an order. She sat on a rock by the wall and said she wanted to understand who he was. Dan said he was a scavenger. So-Yun said that trash collectors don't do what he did with her blades. Dan replied that no trash collector before him had ever tried. So-Yun was silent for a moment. Then she asked why he hadn't joined a guild. With his skills, any guild would have taken him on as a blacksmith. Dan replied that he wasn't a blacksmith. He was an engineer. So-Yun didn't know that word. Dan explained. A blacksmith makes swords. An engineer makes everything. So-Yun snorted and said that sounded arrogant. Dan said that in a month she'd see for herself. So-Yun left. But she came back the next day, and the next. She came in the evening. She sat on the same rock. Sometimes she spoke, sometimes she didn't. Sometimes she brought materials. Sometimes she just sat there and polished the blades. Dan didn't ask why she came. He knew. She came because the workshop was quiet and no one wanted anything from her. In the guild, she was a tool, a weapon on the hunt. Here, she was just a woman sitting on a rock, sharpening blades that smelled of new metal and old memories. By the end of the first month, Dan had a lot. A shelter with a roof and walls, a workbench, a furnace, a 3-month supply of materials, 4 cores of various ranks, a working servo motor, 10 blueprints from the system, 1 apprentice, 1 ally, and the first outlines of a plan he hadn't yet shared with anyone. A workshop. A real one. With tools and apprentices and its own defenses. A place where trash ceases to be trash. A place where things get a second chance, just like the people who bring them in. Dan built a furnace and reforged So-Yun's blades in a new alloy of steel and bone dust, restoring the family crest and his father's hidden inscription. So-Yun began bringing in materials from the hunt and coming to the workshop every evening. Among the materials, Dan found a working ancient servo motor and saw in it the first step toward creating a golem. The system proposed a new blueprint on the 32nd day: a turret, a stationary firing point, components, a bone frame, a servo-based swivel mechanism, a second-rank core as an energy source, a firing unit made of bone needles with a magical accelerator, a sensor module made from a skull plate of the broken one for automatic targeting. Dan read the blueprint and his mouth went dry. It was a weapon, a real, autonomous weapon. It fires on its own. It locks onto targets on its own. It distinguishes targets from humans by their magical signature. He had the components, all but one, the sensor module. He needed a third rank or higher skull plate from a broken one, intact, not cracked, with a functioning sensor array. The creature he'd burned on the trail wouldn't do. Its skull had melted. He needed a fresh one. So-Yun came by in the evening. Dan showed her the blueprint, not the whole thing, just the list of components. She looked at it and asked why he needed a skull plate. Dan said he was building something. So-Yun asked what exactly. Dan replied that he was building a thing that shoots on its own and kills monsters without the hunter's involvement. So-Yun was silent for 10 seconds. Then she said it was impossible. Dan said he heard that every day. So-Yun looked at him for a long time. Then she said she had a hunt tomorrow, third rank, in the northern ruins. If she succeeds, she'll bring back a skull. Dan nodded. So-Yun stood up. She stopped at the exit. She turned around and said she didn't like it when people promised the impossible. Dan replied that he hadn't promised anything. He said he was building. That's different. So-Yun left. The next evening she returned, dirty, with a cut on her shoulder, with a bag from which black liquid was dripping. She tossed the bag by the workbench. Inside lay a third-rank broken skull plate, intact. The sensor array was undamaged. So-Yun said she'd had to cut off the creature's head cleanly and that it had been harder than killing it. Dan examined the plate. Perfect. He thanked her. So-Yun sat down on her rock and began to bandage her shoulder. Dan noticed she was doing it awkwardly. With her left hand, she was protecting her right. He walked over and bandaged it without a word. Her hands were rough, calloused, but precise. 8 years of working with small parts at the factory had taught him how to handle fragile things. So-Yun didn't pull away. She didn't thank him. She just sat there and looked at her blades, which lay by the workbench, glowing blue. Assembling the turret took 5 days, 10 to 12 hours of work every day. Dan got up at dawn and sat down at the workbench. Theo helped in the evenings after his shift at the dump. So-Yun came at night. She didn't help. She sat. She watched. Sometimes she asked questions. Why bone and not metal for the frame? Why that angle for the firing mechanism? Why the sensor on top and not in front? Dan answered briefly. Bone is lighter and stronger. The angle provides maximum firing range. A sensor on top sees farther and is harder to damage. So-Yun memorized it. Dan saw how she memorized it. A hunter. Used to learning quickly. Used to absorbing information that could save a life. She treated his explanations like survival instructions, with complete seriousness. On the third day of assembly, Goran came by. He looked at the half-assembled structure on the workbench. He asked what it was. Dan said it was a turret. Goran didn't know the word. Dan explained, a thing that shoots on its own. Goran looked at him and said he was definitely crazy. Then he left. On the fourth day, 3 janitors came, the ones he'd fixed up during the first week. They brought food, bread, boiled meat, a jug of something murky that turned out to be local beer. They said it was a thank you. Dan accepted it. He shared it with Theo. Theo ate while staring at the turret with wide eyes. Dan worked and ate at the same time. Breadcrumbs fell onto the workbench. He didn't notice. On the 5th day, he finished. The turret stood on the workbench, just over a meter tall. A bone frame, 3 support legs, a servo-driven swivel mechanism, a barrel made of hollow bone with a magical accelerator inside, a magazine for 20 bone needles. On top, a skull plate with a sensor array, a second-rank core in a protected container at the base. Dan connected the core. The turret came to life. The servo motor hummed quietly. The swivel mechanism made a full rotation. The sensor flashed a dim blue light. The turret was active. Now it was time to test it. Dan carried the turret out from behind his cover. He set it on the ground. He aimed it toward the wastelands. So-Yun stood nearby, arms crossed, skeptical. Dan told her to step back 10 paces. So-Yun stepped back. They waited. Theo sat behind the wall, biting his nails. Dan stood 3 meters from the turret and watched the sensor. An hour passed. Nothing. Dan was already starting to think there were no creatures nearby. Then the sensor swiveled, abruptly, to the northeast. The turret swiveled its barrel. Dan saw movement in the darkness. A small creature, first rank, about the size of a cat, crawling among the rubble. The turret fired. The sound was short, a dry click. A bone needle flew out of the barrel and pierced the creature right through. Clean shot. The creature fell. It didn't move. 40 meters away. 1 needle. 1 hit. So-Yun looked at the dead creature, then at the turret, then at Dan. She didn't say anything. But Dan saw her expression change. It wasn't surprise. It was something deeper. Understanding. She had just seen a thing assembled from junk on a workbench kill a monster without a human, without a sword, without magic, without a hunter. So Yun said one sentence. She said she needed to think, and she left. Theo ran out behind the wall. He ran up to the dead creature, then to the turret, then to Dan. He was shaking, but not from fear, from excitement. He asked if Dan could teach him how to make things like that. Dan said he could. But first, Theo had to learn to distinguish high-density bone dust from low-density, and understand the difference between carbon-based and alloyed steel, and memorize the 6 basic types of joints, and 40 other things. Theo said he was ready. Dan said he'd see. He moved the turret to the northern corner of the dump. There was a path where the creatures most often came. He secured it to a stone base. He checked the firing sector. 120 degrees. Effective range, 50 meters. Magazine capacity, 20 rounds. Manual reload. The ammunition supply was enough for 6 months of continuous operation. On the first night, the turret killed 3 first-rank creatures. In the morning, the cleaners came to the dump and saw 3 corpses by the trail, neatly pierced by single needles. No one understood what had happened. Goran went to Dan. He asked. Dan pointed to the turret. Goran looked at the structure. He looked at the corpses. He looked at Dan. He said he no longer considered him a psycho. Now he considered him dangerous. But he added that as long as the turret shot at creatures and not at people, he wouldn't complain. The news spread throughout the dump within a day. By evening, there were not 4 cleaners standing by Dan's shelter, but 12. Not with breakdowns, with questions. What is that thing in the north corner? How does it work? Could Dan put one like that at the south entrance? And at the east one? And by the incineration pits? Dan said he could. But every turret requires a core. Each core had to be extracted from creatures. The creatures had to be killed. To kill them, you needed a hunter or a trap. Traps caught the small ones. For the big ones, you need a hunter. A vicious circle with only one way out, cooperation with the hunters. Word got back to the guilds. Dan didn't know when or through whom, but 3 days after the turret was installed, a man in expensive armor came to the dump. An A-rank hunter from the Iron Fang Guild. A big guy, with a 2-handed sword on his back. He stood in front of the turret and examined it with the expression of someone who'd seen a trick and was trying to figure out the catch. Then he came over to Dan. He said that the guild master, Master Orwell Kane, wanted to meet him. Dan asked why. The hunter replied that Master Kane was interested in devices that kill beasts without hunters. Dan replied that he was busy. The hunter repeated that Master Kane wanted to meet him, in a tone that implied this was not an invitation. Dan looked at him, then at his sword. The interface ran an analysis. A 2-handed sword, medium quality steel, a 5th order enchantment, 30% degradation, a crack along the 3rd edge of the blade, depth, 0.8 millimeters. With a strong blow, the blade will split. Dan told the hunter that his sword had a crack along the 3rd edge, and that he wouldn't drop it. The hunter froze. He drew his sword. He examined it. He didn't see the crack, because it was microscopic, but now he knew about it, and that knowledge would be with him in every battle. Dan added that if Master Kane wanted to talk, he knew where the dump was. The hunter left. So Yun, who had been standing around the corner and had heard the entire conversation, approached. She said that Dan had just refused the most influential man in Hornvale. Dan replied that he hadn't refused. He had offered an alternative. So Yun said that Orwell Kane doesn't go to dumps. Dan replied that in that case, they had nothing to talk about. So Yun looked at him, at his charred apron, at his calloused hands, at the piles of sorted trash behind him. And she said that he was either the bravest man she'd ever met or the stupidest. Dan said he was an engineer, and that engineers don't go to the client. The client comes to the engineer, because an engineer has a workbench, and a workbench doesn't fit in a pocket. So Yun didn't smile, but the corner of her mouth twitched. It was close. That night, Dan didn't sleep. He sat at the workbench and calculated. Resources, time, risks. The Iron Fang Guild is a force, a military force. If Kane decides to take the workshop by force, 1 turret won't stop him. 10 turrets won't stop him. Dan needed time and materials, and allies who would give him both. He opened the interface and scrolled through the list of blueprints. 10 schematics, traps, turrets, defensive structures, tools. Each required components. Every component had to be found or obtained from the hunters. Dan closed the interface and looked into the darkness beyond the wall. Somewhere out there in the ruins, creatures roamed. Somewhere out there in the city, Master Kane sat and decided what to do with the scavenger at the dump. Somewhere out there in the church, priests were preaching salvation through the sword. And Dan sat on a stool in front of his workbench, thinking that every bolt in this world could be made better, every wall stronger, every creature taken apart, and that somewhere in this city there were still people who needed not strength, but precision, not a sword, but a tool, not a hero, but a master. He'll find them, or they'll find him, just like So Young found him, just like Theo found him, just like everyone else will find him, because broken things always find the one who knows how to fix them. Master Orwell Kane didn't come to the dump. His daughter came instead. Dan found out about it on the 41st day. Morning. He was sitting at his workbench, turning needles for a turret. Theo ran up and said there was a woman in red armor standing at the dump gate, and that she looked like she was about to hit someone. Dan went out. The woman was a redhead, tall, wearing heavy breastplate armor bearing the Iron Fang crest, a two-handed sword on her back, a red cloak with a gold trim. Her face was both beautiful and fierce. She stood in the middle of the dump and looked at the mountains of trash around her with the expression of someone who had accidentally stepped in a puddle and was trying to figure out how to move forward. She said her name was Amber Coalfield, that she was the heir to the Iron Fang Guild, and that her father had ordered her to bring the scavenger. Not invite him. Bring him. Dan said he was busy. Amber said she didn't care. Dan looked at her, then at her breastplate. The interface worked instantly. A forged steel breastplate, a 6th order enchantment, masterful work. But a crack running along the left shoulder, depth 1.2 millimeters, hidden beneath decorative engraving, invisible to the eye. With a direct blow to the left shoulder, the breastplate would split along the crack and a shard would pierce the subclavian artery. Death in 3 minutes. Dan told her to take off the breastplate. Amber asked what he'd said. Dan repeated himself. He told her to take off the chest plate, right now, and never wear it again. Amber blushed to the roots of her hair. She said he'd completely lost his mind. Dan stepped closer. He ran his finger along the line of her left shoulder, right along the crack. He said it was right there, a hidden crack, just 2 millimeters long. If she took a hit from the left, the chest guard would shatter and kill her faster than any creature. Amber fell silent. She looked at him, then at her shoulder, then back at him. She asked how he knew. Dan replied that he could see it. Amber slowly unfastened the breastplate. She took it off. She laid it on the workbench. Dan picked it up and showed it to her. He ran his fingernail along the line of the crack. Now that she knew where to look, she saw it. A line as thin as a hair beneath the notch. Her best armorers hadn't noticed it. She'd been wearing it for months, maybe a year. She'd mud into battle, killed creatures, and every time she was one blow away from death. Amber was silent for a long time. Then she asked if he could fix it. Dan said the breastplate needed to be remade. Not fixed, remade, like So Yun's blades. Amber asked how much. Dan quoted the same price, materials from the hunt. Amber looked at him with an expression he didn't immediately understand. Then he understood. Confusion. The heiress of the city's largest guild was used to everything in the world costing money. And this man in the junkyard, in a charred apron, wanted trash. She said she would tell her father that he had refused to come. Dan said he hadn't refused. He had suggested meeting here. Amber said her father didn't go to dumps. Dan replied that he'd already heard that, and that the offer hadn't changed. Amber took the breastplate and left, with quick steps, angry. Theo peeked out from behind the wall and said she looked scary. Dan said she looked scared. Theo didn't get the difference. 3 days later, Amber returned, without armor, in plain clothes. A shirt, pants, boots, no crest, no cloak. Her hair pulled back. She looked younger and angrier. She brought the breastplate in a bag, placed it on the workbench, said her father didn't know she was here, that if he found out, there would be trouble, and that she didn't care. Then she sat down on So Yun's stone. So Yun arrived an hour later. She saw Amber on her stone. She stopped. The two women looked at each other. So Yun knew who Amber was. Amber knew who So Yun was. A former student of the church academy expelled for disrespect. A B-rank lone hunter. So Yun sat down on another rock, silently. Amber turned away without a word. Dan worked and pretended not to notice. The next 5 days were spent working on the breastplate. Dan took it apart completely. Every plate, every fastener, every seam. The breastplate was good, the finest work he'd seen in this world, but it had flaws. Not the flaws of a master, the flaws of tradition. Here, Armor was forged just as it had been 200 years ago. The same methods, the same molds, the same materials. No one had tried to improve the design because no one knew the design could be improved. Dan knew. He redistributed the thickness of the plates, thinner where the blow would glide, thicker where the blow lands directly. He shaved off 200 grams of weight without sacrificing protection. He added an inner layer of bone fabric, soft, shock-absorbing. In Pittsburgh, they called it damping. Here, they didn't know that. A blow to a regular chest protector transfers all the energy to the body. A blow to a chest protector with a damper loses 40% of the energy in the layer. The difference between a broken rib and a bruise. Amber came every evening. She watched. She asked questions. Lots of questions. More than So-Yoon. Different questions. So-Yoon asked how and why. Amber asked why and what if. Why make it thinner if you can make it thicker? What if the blow lands at the joint between the plates? Why have a soft layer inside if it doesn't stop the blade? Dan answered, patiently, without irritation. He saw that behind her questions lay not stupidity, but a different way of thinking. She thought like a fighter. He thought like an engineer. Between these ways lay a chasm, and the bridge across it was being built slowly. On the third day of working on the breastplate, Amber said something unexpected. She said that her whole life she had worn armor chosen by her father, swords chosen by her father, tactics chosen by her father. She had never once asked why her breastplate was exactly like that. She just wore it. Because the coalfields wear the best, and the best is determined by the head of the family. Dan didn't answer. He kept working. Amber paused and added that he was the first person to look at her and see not an heiress, but a technical problem. Dan said that every person is a set of technical problems. The question is whether they solve them themselves or wait for someone else to solve them. Amber stood up and left. Dan noticed that she hadn't left angry, just pensive. On the sixth day, the breastplate was ready. Visually, it had hardly changed. Same crest, same shape, but lighter, stronger, with a damper. No cracks. With additional reinforcement along the lines of maximum stress, Amber put it on, fastened it, twisted the body, raised her arms, squatted, stood up. Her eyes widened. She said she couldn't feel it. Dan said that was exactly what proper armor was like. You don't feel it until you take a hit. Amber took off the breastplate. She turned it over in her hands, put it on again, took it off. She couldn't believe it. The same breastplate, the same metal, but different, completely different. She asked how that was possible. Dan answered with one word: geometry. Amber left with the breastplate. She returned an hour later with 2 bags of materials. She silently set them down by the workbench. She left without a word. So-Yoon came in the evening. She looked at the bags. She asked who they were from. Dan said they were from Amber. So-Yoon was silent for a moment. Then she said that Kane's daughter goes to Dan's dump in plain clothes and hauls trash for him, and that if Kane found out, there would be trouble. Dan said there was already trouble. A few more wouldn't make a difference. So-Yoon snorted. She almost smiled. By the end of the second month, Dan's workshop had grown. 3 rooms. The main one with a workbench and a furnace, a storage room for materials, and a small one for sleeping. Walls made of bone beams and metal sheets. A roof of overlapping plates. No leaks. Dry and warm inside. The turret in the north corner was working properly. In a month, it had killed 17 first and second rank creatures. The dump had become safer than some neighborhoods inside the city. The cleaners noticed this. They started working longer hours. They weren't afraid to stay until dark. For the first time in years, Goran didn't lose a single worker in a month. He didn't thank Dan, but he stopped sending inspectors to check on his hideout. Theo was growing, not physically, as a craftsman. He learned quickly. After 2 months, he could tell the difference between carbon steel from alloy steel by touch. He could determine bone density by the sound of a tap. He could take apart and reassemble a trap with his eyes closed. Dan gave him his first independent assignment, to assemble a set of tools for the cleaners. Simple. A scraper with a bone handle, a carving knife, a hook for pulling wire from the piles. Theo worked for 3 days. The result was rough but functional. Dan examined each item, pointed out the mistakes. Theo reworked them. The second time was better. The third was almost perfect. Dan told him he would make a master. Theo said nothing, but that night Dan heard him tossing and turning on his cot and quietly laughing into his pillow. Everything was changing, slowly, quietly, without fanfare or announcements. A scavenger at the dump was building something for which there was no name in this world. Not a guild, not a church, not an order. Something new. Something made of bolts and bones and the trust of strangers. And the city of Hornvale didn't yet understand what was happening, but it would soon. Amber Caulfield came to the dump on her father's orders, but stayed after Dan discovered a deadly crack in her breastplate. He remade the breastplate with a damper and new geometry, and Amber began secretly bringing in materials. The workshop grew to 3 rooms, and Theo received his first independent assignment. On the 65th day, a girl wearing glasses on a string came into the workshop. Small, skinny, in a baggy Council of Enclaves cloak. With a notebook pressed to her chest like a shield, she stood at the entrance and looked at the workbench and the spread-out materials and the blueprints pinned to the wall with bone pins. Then she looked at Dan. She opened her mouth. She closed it, opened it again. She whispered that her name was Lee Ji-in, that she was an artifactor from the council, that the council had sent her to study the scavenger class phenomenon and compile a report. Dan said she should go ahead and study. Ji-in took out her notebook. She opened it. The pencil trembled in her fingers. She began to write. Dan went back to work. He was assembling the second turret. The components were ready. All that remained was to calibrate the sensor. Ji-un stood behind him and recorded his every move. 2 hours later, she moved closer. 3 hours later, she sat down on the floor next to the workbench. 4 hours later, she asked her first question. Not the one Dan had expected. She asked why he used bone dust as a filler for steel rather than as an outer coating. Dan paused. He looked at her. It was a technical question. A well-informed technical question. He answered. The outer coating degrades from friction. The filler within the metal structure is permanent. Magical conductivity is distributed evenly, not just on the surface. June took notes. She thought. She asked the next question. Why bone dust specifically, and not crystalline dust? Nuclear crystals have higher magical conductivity. Dan replied that crystalline dust is unstable at steel's melting temperature. It disintegrates. Bone dust withstands temperatures up to 1,500 degrees. Ji-yoon took notes. She asked a third question, and a fourth, and a fifth. By evening, she had asked 23 questions, each more precise than the last. Dan realized that he wasn't facing a bureaucrat with a notebook. He was facing a mind, a real one, a sharp one, simply locked away in a notebook because no one had let it out. On the second day, Ji-in arrived early. On the third day, even earlier. On the fourth, she was at the workshop before dawn. She sat on a rock and waited, a notebook in her hands. Not the one from yesterday, a different one. Thick, worn, with dog-eared corners. She opened it and showed it to Dan. These were her own research notes, not a report for the council. Personal work. Years of work. Formulas, diagrams, schemes of magical interactions between materials. A theory of how different types of bones, metals, and crystals influence each other upon contact. How the magical field of one material alters the properties of another. How one can create alloys with predetermined characteristics if one understands these interactions. Dan leafed through the notebook. He read. The formulas were in a language he didn't know, but the logic behind them was familiar. It was material science. Different, magical, but material science. With variables and constants and functions. With experimental data and conclusions. He asked if she had shown this to anyone on the council. Ji-in nodded. She said she had. To the head of the artifactics department. He read the first 3 pages, closed the notebook, said that this was a theory with no practical application, and that Ji-yoon should do real work instead of fantasizing. Dan looked at her, then back at the notebook, then back at her, and said that everything she had written worked, that he sees it every day on the workbench, that her formulas describe what he does intuitively and based on the system's prompts, and that simply no one before her had tried to combine this with that, and that they could try it. Ji-yoon didn't move. The pencil slipped from her fingers and rolled across the floor. Her chin trembled. Her eyes behind her glasses grew wet. She began to cry quietly, right there at the workbench, without a sound. Tears simply streamed down her cheeks and dripped onto the notebook. Dan didn't approach her. He didn't hug her. He didn't say anything comforting. He knew that at that moment, comfort would be condescension, and condescension would be an insult. He simply took a clean rag. He placed it next to her on the workbench and went back to work. 5 minutes later, Ji-yoon wiped her face. She picked up a pencil. She opened her notebook to a blank page and began to write. From that day on, she didn't leave the workshop before midnight. She didn't write the report for the council in the first week, nor in the second, nor in the third. The council sent an inquiry. Ji-yoon replied that the research was ongoing and that the results would come when they came. The council sent a second inquiry. Ji-yoon did not reply. She was busy. She and Dan were conducting their first joint experiment. Ji-yoon had calculated a theoretical formula for an alloy with controllable magical conductivity. An alloy that could be turned on and off. In its normal state, it was a simple metal. When energy was supplied from the core, it became a conductor of magic. Dan assembled an experimental sample based on her formula. 3 attempts. The first was a failure. The alloy delaminated. The second was a partial success. The conductivity fluctuated. The third attempt. Dan added one variable to the formula based on his experience, the cooling rate. In this world, they didn't control the cooling rate during smelting. They just poured the metal and waited. Dan knew that the cooling rate changes the crystal structure. Cool it quickly and you get fine grains. Slowly and you get coarse ones. For controllable conductivity, he needed medium-sized grains with a specific pitch. He controlled the cooling down to the minute. He poured water into the mold in portions. Ji-yoon measured the magical field every 30 seconds. She recorded it. The result? An alloy with controlled conductivity. It works. It turns on and off in response to a signal from the core. The first of its kind in this world's history. Ji-yoon sat in front of the sample and stared at the readings. Then she looked at Dan. She said it was impossible. Dan said he heard that word so often that he'd soon start taking it as a compliment. Ji-yoon laughed. Quietly. Briefly. The first time in all the time Dan had known her. Yoon watched it all from her usual rock. Amber came in the evenings and looked at Ji-yoon with suspicion. Theo ran between everyone, handing out tools. The workshop was filling up with people, slowly, one by one. Each with their own reason, each with their own pain, each with their own broken thing that no one else could carry. On the 8th day, the 4th one arrived, a tall woman in white robes, calm, with a straight back and attentive eyes. A priestess of the Church of the Shining Blade, Grace Whitmore, the bishop's daughter. She had come on an official mission. The church had sent her to declare that the scavenger's methods contradicted the doctrine of salvation through the sword, that the creation of mechanisms to kill beasts without the hunter's involvement was heresy, that Dan Kai must cease his activities and hand over all the devices he has created to the church for destruction. Grace said all this in an even voice, standing in the middle of the workshop. Dan listened in silence. When she finished, he didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He told her to walk around the workshop, to look around, to talk to the people, and then decide. Grace frowned, but she agreed. She spent 3 hours in the workshop. She spoke with Theo, who showed her his tools. With the janitors, who told her how the turret had saved their lives when a creature broke through at night and the hunters weren't there. With a former hunter who had lost an arm, for whom Dan had made a prosthesis, a simple one, made of bone segments and steel joints. The prosthesis didn't restore, but it allowed him to hold a spoon and button his shirt. For a man who hadn't been able to dress himself for 6 months, that was everything. Grace stood in front of the former hunter and watched as he bent and unbent his bony fingers, slowly, awkward, but on his own. Then she went back to Dan. She was silent for a minute, 2. Then she said she would go back to the church and, for the first time in her life, tell her father no. Dan nodded. Grace left. She stopped at the threshold. She turned around and asked if she could come back again. Not as a representative of the church, as a healer. She has patients who need things that don't exist in this world. Surgical instruments, clamps, needles, dilators. All healers use are crude iron contraptions that maim no less than they heal. Dan said she should come, and bring a list of what she needed. Grace came 2 days later, with a long list, and with a story about her brother, whom the church had sent to die at 16. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried in a long time. But her hands trembled as she described the need for a clamp that doesn't tear the tissue but holds it, and a needle that doesn't pierce but sews, and a wound retractor that wouldn't make the patient scream. Dan read the list, nodded, took notes, then said he'd need a week. Grace said she'd waited this long. Another week wouldn't make a difference. Dan worked on the surgical kit alongside the second turret. Turret by day, instruments by night. But whose blueprints? Ji-in helped with the calculations. So-yoon brought the materials. Amber came and watched in silence. Theo ran around and handed things off. The workshop was alive, breathing, working, and everyone in it was in their place. Li Ji-in came from the Council of Enclaves to study Dan and stayed to work in the workshop after he confirmed the value of her research. Together, they created the first alloy with controllable magical conductivity. Grace Whitmore from the Church of the Shining Blade came to declare Dan a heretic, but saw his work with the wounded and prosthetics, and refused the churches and ordered a set of surgical instruments. Dan finished the surgical set on the 86th day. 6 items, each made for a specific task and specific hands. He measured Grace's palms on the second day of work, the length of her fingers, the width of her grip, the angle at which she was accustomed to holding an instrument. Grace asked why. Dan replied that the instrument should be an extension of the hand, not an obstacle to it. 2 forceps, slender, made of bone steel, jaws polished to a mirror finish. They didn't tear the fabric, they held it, gently, precisely, like fingers. A spring made of treated bone, calibrated so precisely that the clamp could be closed with a single movement of the thumb and opened with another. 2 needles, with a magical core made from a fragment of a first-rank core. As it passed through the tissue, the core emitted a microscopic pulse. This pulse accelerated the healing process. A regular needle sews and leaves a suture. This needle sewed and began to heal simultaneously. Wound spreader, the most complex instrument in the set. 4 petals made of the finest bone steel. They open smoothly, no jerking, no sharp edges. The surface is coated with a thin layer of a compound that Ji-yoon calculated using her own formulas. The compound numbed the tissue upon contact. The patient felt pressure, but no pain. And the final instrument, a scalpel, a blade made of pure arcanite bronze, 1 millimeter thick, sharper than anything else in this world. It cuts through tissue and bone with equal precision. The handle was made of treated wood covered in soft leather. Beneath the leather was an engraved plate, the name Grace. Grace came for the set that evening. Dan laid out the instruments on a clean cloth. 6 items. Each one gleamed. Each one lay in its place. Grace approached. She picked up the clamp, squeezed it, opened it, closed it. Her hands didn't tremble. For the first time during their entire conversation, her hands didn't tremble. She picked up the needle, ran her finger along the shaft, felt the warmth. She picked up the dilator, spread the petals, slowly, smoothly, silently. She put it back. She took the scalpel. She turned it over. She looked at the blade, at the handle, at her hands, which held it as if it had been made for them, because it had been made for them. Grace stood in silence. Then she said that everything in her life had been made into a weapon for her, so she could take revenge. And Dan had made her tools, so she could save. Dan didn't answer. He was cleaning up the workbench. Grace put the set into the case Theo had sewn from leather to fit the tools. She fastened it, pressed it to her chest, stood there for a second. Then she left. Theo said he'd seen too many strange women today for one day. Dan told him to go to sleep. The next morning, a girl was standing at the workshop gate. Small, skinny, dirty. About 17, but she looked 13. Short hair, cut unevenly. Her clothes were torn. Her boots had no soles. She stood there looking at the workshop, not at Dan, at the workshop, at the walls, at the workbench visible through the doorway, at the piles of sorted materials, at the blueprints on the walls. Her eyes were hungry, not from malnutrition, from thirst. She wanted to be inside. Dan came out. He asked who she was. The girl said her name was Mina Song, that she was an orphan from the slums, that her mother had died 3 years ago and her father had been killed in a mine even earlier, that she'd heard about the workshop at the dump, and that she was willing to work at anything if he would take her on as an apprentice. Dan looked at her, skinny, pale. Her hands were scraped, but her eyes were clear, and she stood up straight. She didn't slouch. She didn't avert her gaze. He asked why she wanted to learn from him specifically. Mina said she had gone to every blacksmith in town. They all turned her down. Some because she was a girl, others because she had no money for tuition, others because they don't take half-breeds. Dan asked what a half-breed was. Mina explained. Her father was from Hornvale. Her mother was a refugee from another enclave. Here, that meant she was nobody's. Neither one of us nor one of them. Dan told her to come to the workbench. Mina approached. He placed 3 objects in front of her. A bone fragment, a piece of metal, a shard of crystal. He told her to choose any one and describe what she felt. Mina looked at the objects. She reached out. She picked up the bone. She turned it over in her fingers. She frowned. She said the bone was sad. Dan didn't interrupt. Mina put down the bone. She picked up the metal. She held it. She said it was angry. Cold and angry. She put it down. She picked up the crystal. She held it for a long time. Then she said it was tired, like a person who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and finally set it down. Dan watched her. Then he opened the interface and checked. The bone belonged to a young Broken killed in a trap. Young Broken didn't have time to develop a full skeleton. The system described the condition as an incomplete formation. Sad. The metal was a fragment of a blade used in battle. Traces of impact stress. Residual deformation from a high-energy collision. Angry. The crystal was a depleted core. 2% charge. A former high-power source. Now almost empty. Tired. Mina didn't read the interface. She didn't have a system. She simply picked up objects and felt them. Not magic. Not a skill. Something else. An intuition for materials. A gift she hadn't even suspected she had. Dan said he was taking her on. Mina blinked. Asked him to repeat it. Dan repeated himself. Said she'd be a better master than him in 10 years. And now she needed to go to work. Mina stood there, motionless. Then her chin trembled. She clenched her fists. Dan could see she was fighting it. She didn't want to cry. Not in front of him. Not here. Not on her first day. She pulled herself together, nodded, said she was ready. Dan put her on sorting, the most basic work, sifting through piles of material, sorting by type, metal, bone, crystals, organic matter, miscellaneous. The work was dirty, heavy, monotonous. Mina didn't complain. She worked in silence, quickly. By the end of the first day, she had sorted more than Theo had in 2. Theo watched her with suspicion, then with respect. Then with that feeling 12-year-old boys have toward girls who work better than they do and which they can't quite name. That evening, Mina sat on the workshop threshold. She didn't leave. Dan asked if she had anywhere to go. Mina said no. Dan said there was room for a second cot in the storage room. She nodded. That night, Dan woke up to a sound. Quiet. Distant. He got up and went outside. Mina was sitting on the workshop roof. Her legs dangled over the edge. She was looking up at the sky. A gray night sky with sparse stars. And she was laughing quietly. Not out of joy, out of relief. Like a person who had been drowning for a long time and finally took a breath. Dan didn't disturb her. He went back inside, lay down, closed his eyes. Now there were 5 of them. Him, Theo, So-yoon, Amber, Ji-yoon, Grace, Mina. No, 7. Kai's workshop. 3 rooms in the junkyard, 2 workbenches, 1 kiln, 1 turret, 2 apprentices. 4 women, each carrying something broken, and each finding a place here where that broken thing didn't need to be hidden. And 1 master who didn't make things at all. He made a thing for you. Dan finished a surgical kit for Grace with an anesthetic dilator and needles with a magical core. Mina Song came to ask to be taken on as an apprentice and demonstrated an innate intuition for materials, guessing the condition of objects by touch. Dan accepted her, and the workshop grew to 7 people. The 3rd month began with cold. Real cold. Not the damp autumn kind, but winter. Icy. The temperature dropped every day. The ash in the dump froze into a gray crust. The cleaners worked twice as slowly because their fingers wouldn't obey them. Theo would come into the workshop with blue lips. Dan would warm him up by the stove and think. The city was freezing. Not the workshop, the city. The Hornvale Enclave was heated by a central magical boiler, an ancient machine from the time before the rift. No one knew how it worked. They only knew how to turn it on. They poured cores into the feed hatch. The boiler drew energy and heated. Pipes from the boiler ran beneath the streets and carried heat into the buildings. The system worked. Poorly, but it worked. Until the 93rd day. Theo rushed into the workshop and said something had broken in the city. The pipes had gone cold. The buildings were getting cold. People were wrapping themselves in whatever they had. Children were getting sick. The Enclave Council called an emergency meeting. Dan went into the city. For the first time in 3 months, he had hardly ever been inside the walls. His world was a dump, but now he had to see it with his own eyes. The city was gray, like everything in this world. Concrete buildings, narrow streets, people in heavy clothing, guild signs, the spires of the Church of the Shining Blade, the Enclave Council Tower, and the cold. Cold everywhere, steam from people's mouths, frost on the walls. Dan reached the central square. There stood a boiler, huge, the size of a two-story house, metal, with pipes leading into the ground in all directions. People were bustling around it. Council technicians. They were running and shouting and opening hatches and peering inside, and didn't understand a thing. The city's chief engineer stood in front of the cauldron, looking like a man whose only thing that he couldn't fix had broken. Dan walked over. He stood beside him. He looked at the boiler. The interface popped up. A magical boiler, manufactured before the rift. Type: recuperative thermogenerator. Status: critical malfunction. 3 out of 5 circuits are blocked. Cause: deposits of magical slag in the heat exchangers, accumulated over 12 years of operation without maintenance. Prognosis: complete shutdown in 48 hours without intervention. Dan read and understood. The boiler wasn't broken. The boiler was clogged. For 12 years, they had been feeding it cores and extracting heat. No one cleaned it. No one checked it. No one changed the filters because no one knew there were filters. Slag from processing the cores had accumulated in the heat exchangers. It clogged the tubes. It reduced flow. The boiler performed worse and worse year after year. And finally, 3 of the 5 circuits shut down. The city's chief engineer noticed Dan. He asked who he was. Dan said he was a garbage collector from the dump. The engineer wanted to send him away, but Ji-yoon was standing nearby. She had come with Dan. She said this man knew more about machinery than anyone else in the city. The engineer looked at her council coat, then at Dan, at his soot-stained apron and dirty hands, then at the boiler, and he waved his hand, as if to say, "Do whatever you want, it can't get any worse." Dan asked for a stool. They brought him one. He sat down in front of the boiler. He opened the main cover. He peered inside, and froze. 6 hours. He sat in front of the open boiler and watched. He didn't touch it. He didn't fiddle with it. He just watched. The interface ran continuously. It displayed every component, every tube, every valve, every connection. Dan memorized it. He read the machine like a book, line by line, page by page. The boiler was beautiful, truly beautiful. The ancient civilization knew how to build. 5 heat exchange circuits, a cascading recovery system. Magic drew energy from the cores and converted it into heat. The spent energy didn't go to waste. It returned for a second cycle, then a third. 5 cycles. Efficiency around 90%. In Pittsburgh, they dreamed of something like this. But 3 circuits were completely clogged. The slag had fused into a glassy mass. It had caked onto the walls of the heat exchangers and blocked the channels. The 2 remaining circuits were running on fumes. 2 more days and they'd shut down too. 6 hours later, Dan got up. He walked silently to the junkyard. Ji-yoon followed him. The chief engineer shouted after him, asking him to explain where he was going. Dan didn't answer. He spent 2 hours at the junkyard, gathering 3 boxes of parts, bone scrapers of various sizes, thin steel rods, copper wire, pieces of arcanite bronze, a solvent made from a mixture of oils and bone dust that he had developed a month ago for cleaning parts, and one thing he had been working on secretly for the past 2 weeks without telling anyone. A pressure regulator, a simple valve, a spring, a diaphragm, a lever. He assembled it from memory, based on a diagram of a pressure-reducing valve from the factory water supply system in Pittsburgh, adapted for magical variables. In this world, there was no concept of a pressure regulator. Here, magical systems operated in an all-or-nothing mode, full power or off. The regulator allowed for smooth control the flow of energy, increase it, decrease it, stabilize it. The difference between an 18th century steam boiler and a modern power plant. Dan returned to the boiler with 3 boxes. It was night. The square was deserted. Only 2 technicians were on duty at the entrance. Dan asked them to leave. They left. He remained alone in front of a machine that no one had understood for 12 years. And he began to work. All night long. First, cleaning. He opened each of the 3 clogged circuits. He applied a solvent. The bone dust in the solution reacted with the magical slag and softened it. Then the scrapers. Thin, precise. Dan cleaned the tubes one by one, carefully, without damaging the walls. The slag came off in chunks, glassy, heavy. He set it aside. Slag is material too, recycling later. By 3 in the morning, all the circuits were clean. Then the replacements. 2 valves in the distribution unit were worn out. Dan replaced them with new ones, made of arcanite bronze, more precise and durable than the originals. Then the modification. He installed a pressure regulator at the outlet of the first circuit, connected it to the main flow, adjusted it, turned the lever. The diaphragm responded with a smooth movement. Ji-yoon sat nearby and recorded every action. By dawn, Dan closed the cover. He stood up. His back ached. His hands were black with slag. His eyes were watering from fatigue. He loaded the cores into the loading hatch. He pulled the start lever. The boiler hummed. Quietly, smoothly, without the vibration that had been there before. All 5 circuits were working. All 5. The pipes beneath the square began to warm up. An hour later, heat began to flow through them. 2 hours later, the city began to warm up. By lunchtime, the temperature in the buildings had risen. Not to the previous level. Higher, 1.5 times higher. The pressure regulator had evened out the energy flow, eliminated the spikes, eliminated the losses. The boiler was running more efficiently than on the day it was built. The Council of Enclaves came to thank him. 3 council members, in expensive cloaks, with officials. Dan stood in front of the boiler in a soot-stained apron, his hands black and his eyes red from lack of sleep. They said the city was grateful. They asked what he wanted as a reward. Dan said he didn't need payment, but he had a condition. Hornvale must stop burning the dump. The councilors exchanged glances. They asked why. Dan replied that the dump was his warehouse, and that everything the city threw away, he could turn into things that would save this city. The councilors exchanged glances again. The elder said it was an unusual request. Dan said he was an unusual craftsman. The council agreed, by official decree. From that day on, the Hornvale Enclave would no longer burn trash. Dan stood in the square and looked at the warm pipes beneath his feet, and at the people coming out of buildings without scarves, and at the children running down the street instead of lying in bed with a fever. Ji-yoon stood beside him. She said quietly that he had just changed the city. Dan said he had simply cleaned the pipes. Ji-yoon shook her head. She knew it was more than that. Much more. It was a decision that would save the continent a year from now. But right now it was just cleaning pipes, and warm feet, and children who weren't sick. Dan returned to the workshop and slept for 12 hours straight. For the first time since the transfer, he didn't dream a thing. Hornville's central magic boiler had broken down, and the city was starting to freeze. In a single night, Dan cleared the clogged pipes and installed a homemade pressure regulator, increasing the boiler's efficiency by 50%. In return, he asked the council to stop burning the landfill and received an official decree. After the boiler was repaired, the city learned the name of Dan K. Not everyone, not right away, but enough people. Rumors spread from the janitors to the merchants, from the merchants to the hunters, from the hunters to the guilds. A garbage collector from the dump repaired a boiler that not a single engineer understood. A garbage collector builds turrets that kill monsters on their own. A garbage collector forges blades better than any blacksmith. A garbage collector assembles things from what everyone else considered junk. Master Orwell Kane heard about it, and this time he didn't send messengers. On the 100th day, 12 hunters stood at the workshop gates. A rank, heavy armor, weapons at the ready. Standing before them was Orwell Kane, tall, broad-shouldered, a graying beard, eyes cold and intelligent, a cloak bearing the Iron Fang crest, a 2-handed sword at his back, not decorative, a working sword. He stood in front of the workshop and looked at it the way a man looks at a weed that has sprouted through a crack in his wall. With irritation, with a touch of respect for stubbornness, and with a firm intention to uproot it. Dan came out, in an apron, with a cutting torch in his hand. He was working on the 3rd turret and wasn't expecting guests. Kane said he'd come in person, just as Dan had requested. Dan replied that he appreciated it. Kane said he'd get down to business. Dan's workshop was creating devices that were shifting the balance of power in Hornvale. The turrets were killing the beasts without hunters. This means that hunters are losing their value. Hunters losing their value means the guilds are losing influence. Guilds losing influence means Kane is losing power. He wasn't going to let that happen. Kane proposed a deal. Dan hands over all the blueprints and technology to the Iron Fang Guild. In return, he gets the position of the guild's chief blacksmith. Housing, a salary, protection, unlimited materials, everything a master could want. But the workshop at the scrapyard would close, and all the devices would belong to the guild. Dan listened. Then he replied, "No." Kane wasn't surprised. He'd expected a refusal. That's why he'd brought 12 hunters. He said this wasn't a request. Dan said that he understood, and that the answer was still no. Kane looked at him. for a long time. Then he said he was giving him 3 days. In 3 days, he would return. If the workshop was still operating, he would take it by force. He turned and left. The 12 hunters followed him. Theo stood behind the wall, trembling. Mina stood beside him, not trembling. She clenched her fists and watched the hunters leave with an expression Dan had only seen in stray dogs. A pent-up rage. So-Yoon arrived an hour later. She already knew. Everyone in town knew. Kane hadn't hidden it. She said Dan needed to leave, to take his students and go to another enclave. Hornvale was too small for a war with the guild. Dan said he wasn't going anywhere. So-Yoon asked why. Dan replied that he had a workbench and a furnace and 3 tons of materials, and a workbench doesn't fit in a pocket. So-Yoon said that wasn't funny. Dan said he wasn't joking. Then he looked at her and said he had 3 days, and that in 3 days, he'd make sure Kane wouldn't want to touch the workshop. So-Yoon asked how. Dan opened the interface. He scrolled through the blueprints. He found the right one. He showed it to So-Yoon. She couldn't see the interface. Dan described it in words. 12 turrets, modified, with increased ammunition capacity, with enhanced sensors, with a non-lethal mode added. Not bone needles. Capsules with sedative gas. Gas made from cheap herbs that grew in abundance at the dump, mixed with a compound made from the remains of a lamp mechanism. When inhaled, a person falls asleep in 3 seconds, wakes up in 2 hours, harmless. So-Yoon asked if he could assemble 12 turrets in 3 days. Dan said he could, if everyone helped. So-Yoon was silent. Then she said that he was definitely crazy and that she was staying. Amber came at night, on the sly, without armor, with red eyes. She knew her father would arrive in 3 days. She said she'd tried to talk him out of it. He wouldn't listen. She said she didn't know whose side she was on. Dan replied that she didn't need to choose a side. She needed to decide who she wants to be. An heir who follows her father's orders, or a person who makes her own decisions. Amber left without a word. 3 days, 72 hours. Dan didn't sleep a wink. Ji-Yoon calculated the optimal turret placement. 12 points, 3 tiers, overlapping firing sectors, 0 blind spots. So-Yoon brought the materials, everything they had, their own supplies from caches in the wastelands. Mina sorted them, quickly, exactly. Her intuition for materials sped up the process threefold. She'd take a part in her hand and instantly say whether it was suitable or not. Theo ran around, passing things, holding, securing. Grace arrived on the 2nd day. She said that if there were any wounded, she'd be here. Dan said there wouldn't be any wounded. Grace looked at him and said she'd be here anyway. Dan was assembling turrets one after another. Frames, servo motors, sensors, firing units, capsule magazines. Mina made the capsules. Thin shells made of processed bone. Inside, a powder of dried herbs mixed with a reagent from the lamp mechanism. Upon impact, the shell splits open, the powder disperses. 3 seconds, and the person is asleep. Mina made the capsules with a precision that surprised even Dan. Her hands moved quickly and confidently. She never made a mistake. Not once. By dawn on the 3rd day, 12 turrets were in position, 3 tiers, overlapping fire. A total ammunition supply of 240 capsules. Dan walked around each one, checked them, calibrated them. Every sensor was tuned to the magical signature of a living human. Not creatures, people. When an armed person with hostile intentions approached, the turret would activate. Identify the target. Fires. Capsule. Sleep. That's it. Kane arrived on the 4th morning, with the same 12 hunters, fully combat ready. He walked toward the workshop with the confident stride of a man accustomed to the world parting before him. The first turret fired when they were 30 meters away. The hunter on the right fell. The second turret. Another one. The third. The fourth. The hunters didn't have time to figure out where the shots were coming from. The capsules didn't whistle. They didn't flash. A quiet click and a cloud of dust by the face. 3 seconds later, their legs buckled. 5 seconds later, sleep. 12 A-rank hunters, Iron Fang's best fighters, down in 40 seconds. Not a single one had time to draw a weapon. Not a single one was wounded. They simply fell asleep. Kane was left standing alone. The turrets didn't fire at him. Dan had reprogrammed them manually. He wanted the guild leader to be conscious. Kane stood among the 12 sleeping hunters and looked at the workshop, at the bone walls, at the turrets he couldn't make out, at Dan, who came out to him in an apron, his hands black from 3 days of work. Dan said his men were unharmed, that they would wake up in 2 hours, that he didn't want a war with Kane, that he wanted to work, just work, and that if Kane came a third time, Dan wouldn't be so polite. Kane was silent. He looked at Dan, at the workshop behind him, at the sleeping hunters at his feet. Then he turned and left, alone. In the morning, 12 hunters lay at the gates of the Iron Fang Guild, neatly stacked, with a note. Take them, they're unharmed. Next time, I won't be so polite. Kai. Theo and Mina hauled them away in a wheelbarrow that night. So-yun provided cover. The whole city saw it. The whole city knew. A garbage collector from the dump had taken down 12 A-rank hunters without scratching a single one. It was impossible. It was real, and it changed everything. Kane hadn't forgiven it. Dan knew that. A man like Orwell Kane doesn't forgive public humiliation. He waits. He builds up. He chooses his moment. And he strikes when the enemy is sure the danger has passed. A month had passed since the turret incident. A quiet month. Too quiet. The Iron Fang Guild didn't come. Didn't send people. Didn't threaten. Kane acted as if the workshop didn't exist. That frightened So-yun more than open hostility. She said Kane was planning something big. Dan agreed, but he wasn't going to stop. Over the course of that month, the workshop had changed. 4 former janitors asked to become apprentices. Dan took 3. The 4th didn't make the cut, not because he was bad, because he was afraid of fire. And without a furnace, a blacksmith is no blacksmith. Now Dan had 5 apprentices, Theo, Mina, and 3 new ones. Guys between 18 and 20, strong, silent, used to hard work. Dan drove them mercilessly, sorting, turning, forging, assembly, disassembly, reassembly, 12 hours a day. Mina outpaced everyone. Her intuition for materials was developing. She no longer just sensed objects. She predicted their behavior. She'd take a piece of steel and say it would crack in a certain spot when forged. And it would crack. Right there. Dan gave her increasingly complex tasks. She handled them, silently, stubbornly, with burning eyes. So-yun became a permanent fixture in the workshop. She no longer just sat on the stone. She coordinated. She brought back information from the city. She monitored the guild's activities. She tracked the movements of the beasts in the wastes. She was a scout, the best in Hornvale. And now her skills were working not for the guild, but for the workshop. Amber hadn't come for 2 weeks after the incident with her father. Then she came, at night, without a word. She sat on the stone. She sat for an hour. She left. The next night she came back. On the 3rd night she spoke. She said her father had forbidden her from going near the dump, that she'd disobeyed him, that she didn't care, that she no longer wanted to be a tool in someone else's hands, not in her father's, not in anyone's. Dan said that a tool only becomes a tool when it agrees to be one. Amber looked at him and smiled for the first time ever. Crooked, angry, but she smiled. Ji-yoon lived in the workshop, practically. Her cot stood in the corner of the lab that Dan had set up in the new annex. The council sent a 3rd request for a report. Ji-yoon wrote 3 lines. Research is ongoing. The phenomenon exceeds initial estimates. I recommend an extension of the mandate. The council didn't know what to do with this and temporarily left her alone. Gray came by every other day. She treated students with burns from the furnace, janitors with cuts, hunters who had heard about her instruments and came secretly, away from their guilds. Dan's surgical kit had changed her practice. She operated faster, cleaner. Patients recovered twice as fast. Rumors of a healer with magical instruments spread throughout the city. The church was displeased, but it didn't dare touch the bishop's daughter. On the 130th day, Dan finished the project he'd been working on at night for the past 6 weeks. A wall. Not around the workshop, around an entire neighborhood. Hornwell's northern neighborhood bordered the wastelands and suffered from the creatures more than any other. Raids every week. Casualties every month. People were leaving. The neighborhood was emptying out. Dan proposed a deal to the council. He would reinforce the northern neighborhood's wall using his own methods, for free. In exchange, the block would become the workshop's territory. The council agreed because the block was dying anyway. The wall was special. Bone beams dug deep into the ground. Between them, concrete blocks saturated with a mixture of bone dust and magical slag. The very same slag that Dan had cleaned out of the cauldron. When processed, the slag became a powerful magical insulator. A wall made of this mixture created a barrier that the broken could sense. They couldn't see it, they could feel it. To them, the wall was a wall of pain. As you approached, every magical circuit in your body began to resonate at a frequency that caused discomfort. The creature didn't understand why it felt bad. It simply went around it. Dan installed 6 turrets along the perimeter. For those who didn't want to go around, Jiyun calculated the resonance frequency. Mina prepared the impregnation mixture. Theo coordinated the students who hauled the materials. So Yoon stood on the perimeter and made sure no creature interfered with the construction. 3 weeks of work. The wall stood. The northern quarter came to life. People returned. For the first time in years, there were no raids in the quarter. Not a single one. The creatures weren't even visible from the watchtowers. They skirted the quarter in an arc, like a river flows around a rock. The Council of Enclaves came to the workshop for the first time, not with a demand, but with a request. They asked if Dan could build the same wall for the entire city. Dan replied that he could. But for that, he needed all the magical slag the city would produce over the next year. And bones. Lots of bones. And time. And for no one to interfere. The council promised to think it over. Dan knew they would agree. They had no choice. The creatures were multiplying. Every month, every week. The broken were evolving. New types were appearing. Faster, smarter, more dangerous. Hunters were dying. Hornwell's walls held, but the cracks were growing. Not in the concrete, in the people. In hope. In the belief that tomorrow would be better than today. Dan didn't promise it would be better. He built. Silently. Stubbornly. Bolt by bolt. Wall by wall. Turret by turret. And every evening he returned to his workbench and worked until dawn. Because dawn comes only to those who do not sleep. The workshop grew to 5 apprentices and became a magnet for wounded hunters and city residents. Dan built a protective wall of bone compound around the northern quarter that frightens the broken with its magical resonance. The Council of Enclaves asked to extend the protection to the entire city. Cain struck on the 150th day, not at the workshop, at the city. He drove the Iron Fang Guild out of Hornvale, all of them. 200 hunters, 70% of the city's fighting force. They left at dawn, without warning, without explanation. A caravan of wagons and armed men moved south toward the Grey Hall Enclave. Cain left a note for the council. 1 line. You have a scavenger. You don't need hunters. The city fell into panic. The Iron Fang Guild was Hornwall's shield. Without it, all that remained were small squads of independent hunters and the city guard who didn't know how to fight the beasts. The council convened an emergency meeting. They discussed evacuation. They discussed calling on other enclaves for help. They discussed surrender. No one discussed the obvious. Cain wanted to prove that without the hunters, the city was dead. That the scavenger and his turrets meant nothing. That the only real power was people with swords, and he was ready to kill an entire city to prove it. So Yoon brought the news to the workshop. Her face was stony. She said a wave was coming from the wastes. Not a raid, a wave. Scouts had spotted movement. Dozens of creatures, maybe hundreds. They were moving toward Hornvale, as if they knew the city was defenseless. Amber arrived an hour after her father left, in full battle armor, with a sword, with eyes full of cold fury. She said she hadn't left with the guild, that she'd stayed, that it was her choice. Dan nodded. He asked how many independent hunters were left in the city. So Yoon answered. About 30, various ranks, mostly B and C, a few A-rank loners. Dan did the math. 30 hunters, 12 turrets at the workshop, 6 on the north wall, a defensive wall around the block. Materials. Time. He had 2 days before the wave hit. He gathered everyone. So-yoon, Amber, Ji-yoon, Grace, Mina, Theo, the apprentices. He stood before them in the workshop, in an apron, with black hands, and said that no one was running anywhere, that they had enough materials, that he had a plan, and that every one of them was needed. Mina asked what to do. Dan answered with one word. Build. 2 days. 48 hours. The workshop turned into a military factory. Dan worked non-stop, coordinating, assembling, calculating. Top priority, turrets. 10 more of them. There were enough materials, enough cores. Over the past few months, So-yoon had brought back so many trophies from the hunt that the warehouse was full. Ji-yoon calculated the layout for the defense of the entire city. Not just the workshop, all of Hornvale. 28 turrets, in 3 tiers, with overlapping sectors. Dan assembled them one by one. Mina made the ammunition. Not tranquilizing. Combat rounds. Bone needles with cores made of shrapnel from warheads. Upon impact, the core releases an energy pulse inside the target. It destroys the broken one's magical circuits from within. Theo and the students mounted the turrets at key points. They hauled them across the rooftops, secured them to the walls, laid power lines from the cores. So-Yoon coordinated the independent hunters. Not everyone agreed. Some were already packing their things, but 22 hunters remained. So-Yoon divided them into groups, mobile squads, 4 people in each. The task is simple. Turrets held the perimeter, hunters finished off anything that broke through. Amber took the main gate, alone. Arang, Kane's daughter, with the breastplate Dan had made. With a fury that needed no words, Grace set up a field hospital in the workshop, every tool in stock, every bandage, every potion she could get her hands on. She organized 3 women from the neighborhood to assist her. She taught them basic bandaging and triage in 2 hours. Second priority, the walls. Dan couldn't reinforce all the city walls in 2 days, but he could shore up the weak spots. Ji-yoon pointed out the spots. 4 sections where the concrete was crumbling and the magical protection had thinned. Mina and the students mixed the bone compound in huge vats. Theo hauled it around in a wheelbarrow. They applied it to the walls, roughly, quickly, ugly, but it worked. Third priority, light. Dan assembled 8 spotlights from old lighthouses he'd found at the junkyard. Lenses made of polished crystal. The light source was a magical core with a focusing circuit. A bright white beam. The broken weren't afraid of light, but the light allowed the turrets to see farther, and the hunters not to fight blindly. The floodlights were mounted on 4 towers and on the workshop roof. By the end of the second day, the city was ready, or as ready as a city could be that had lost 70% of its fighters and was preparing for an assault by the scavengers' forces and 30 hunters. Dan stood on the workshop roof. Before him was a panel, 40 toggle switches, each controlled a turret or a searchlight. Next to it stood a custom separate transmitter, a headset in his ear, frequencies for each group. Ji-yoon had tuned them in. Down in the workshop, Grace was laying out tools. Mina sat on a box of ammunition and waited silently. Theo stood by the workshop gate with a wheelbarrow, ready to run to any point. So-Yoon was somewhere in the darkness beyond the walls. Reconnaissance. Her voice hissed in the headset. She said she could see them. Hundreds, maybe more, moving from the northeast. Among them are large ones. 4th rank, 5th, and something else, something huge in the rear, behind the mass of creatures. Dan asked what exactly. So-Yoon paused. Then she said one word. Root. Kane led the Iron Fang Guild out of the city to prove the scavengers' uselessness, and a wave of broken ones, with the root in their rear, moved toward the defenseless Hornvale. Over 2 days, Dan and the team set up a defense of 28 turrets and searchlights, while Amber stayed behind to defend the city against her father's wishes. The root. A gigantic growth of living metal. A monster factory. It churned out new creatures every hour. Not every night like ordinary roots. Every hour. This one was different. Older, bigger. So-Yoon described it as a hill that moves. Dan closed his eyes for 3 seconds, opened them, looked at the panel. 40 toggle switches, 28 turrets, 8 searchlights, 4 communication frequencies, 30 hunters in position, 6 women who trusted him, 1 kid with a wheelbarrow, against an army. He turned on the searchlights. 8 beams of white light cut through the darkness, and Dan saw. The wastelands before Hornwall were teeming. The creatures moved as a solid mass. The small ones in front, the 1st and 2nd ranks. Behind them, the larger ones, the 3rd, the 4th. On the flanks, something long and fast, the 5th rank. And behind it all, he moved. A root, not a hill, a mountain. A living mountain of twisted metal and bone. New creatures were growing on its surface, like fruit on a tree, ripening and falling to the ground and running forward, a walking death factory. Dan put on his headset. His voice was steady, calm, without a tremor. He told all groups to take up positions. Yoon, take reconnaissance outside the perimeter. Amber to the main gates. Northern groups to the northern points. The first wave of small ones in 4 minutes. Turrets are on auto. Don't waste energy on the small stuff. Save yourselves for the big ones. 4 minutes passed quickly. The first rank broken entered the strike zone. The turrets opened fire. Dry clicks, one after another. Bony needles with energy cores flew into the darkness and found their targets. Every hit was a flash. The core exploded inside the creatures. It shattered their magical contours. The creature fell. Next, next, next. 28 turrets fired continuously. The northern wall held. The turrets mowed down the small creatures by the dozen. Corpses piled up at the base of the wall. But there were too many of them. For every one killed, 2 more followed. The root spawned new ones faster than the turrets could kill the old ones. 20 minutes later, the first third-rank creatures reached the wall. The turrets took them down, but not with a single shot. Third rank required 3 or 4 hits. The rate of destruction was dropping. Dan was calculating. Ammo, rate of consumption, rate at which new targets were approaching. The math was simple and brutal. At the current rate of fire, the ammo would last 2 hours. The root wouldn't stop in 2 hours. He tuned into So-Yun's frequency. He told her he needed a flanking attack on the large ones. So-Yun replied that she was already on it. Her mobile unit went over the wall and struck the 4th-rank creatures on the right, 2B and So-Yun with new blades. The bone steel blades sliced through the broken ones like butter. The magic within the metal structure resonated with the creature's magical circuits and destroyed them on contact. So-Yun moved quickly. 2 blades, 2 swings, the creature falls. Next, she danced among the monsters, and every movement was precise and economical. Amber held the main gate. A 4th-rank creature broke through the grate. Amber met it with a blow from above. Her chest plate with the shock absorber took the counterblow. She didn't even waver. Before, such a blow would have broken her ribs. Now a bruise, nothing more. She slashed and didn't stop. Grace was working in the hospital. The first wounded arrived 40 minutes later, a hunter with a torn shoulder. Grace grabbed the clamp. That one. She stopped the bleeding in seconds. A needle with a magical core, a stitch. Healing began immediately. The hunter was back on his feet 10 minutes later and returned to the wall. For the first time in Hornwell's history, the wounded weren't dying on the way. Mina was running, between checkpoints, with ammunition boxes on her back, small and fast, reloading the turrets, one after another. 16 seconds per reload. She'd practiced the technique until it became second nature over the last 2 days. Run up, open the magazine, insert the clip, close it, run on. Theo was right beside her, with a wheelbarrow, bringing up the boxes. A kid who was scared sick, but he ran, because if he stopped, Mina would have to run for ammo herself and lose time, and time meant lives. An hour passed. The wall held. The turrets were working. The hunters were fighting. But the root was approaching, slowly, relentlessly, crushing everything in its path with its mass. Debris from buildings, remnants of the road, its own creatures that hadn't managed to get out of the way. Dan watched it from the roof of the workshop. He was counting. The root was a kilometer from the wall. At its speed, it would reach the city in an hour. When it reached the wall wouldn't hold. No impregnation would stop a creature weighing thousands of tons. A different solution was needed. Dan opened the interface. He flipped through the blueprints. He found what he was looking for. A diagram the system had suggested 2 weeks ago, and which he had set aside because there was no reason to use it. A directed energy discharge. The principle was simple. A high-rank core, a focusing circuit made of arcanite bronze, a lens made of bone crystal. One shot, all the core's energy in a single second, in a directed beam, like lightning. Dan had a 3rd-rank core, that very one, the damaged one. 47% charge, not full, but enough, if the calculation is correct. He called Ji in. She was downstairs in the lab. He dictated the parameters to her, asked her to check the calculation. Ji-in calculated for 3 minutes. She replied that the calculation was correct, with a margin of error of 12%. The power would be enough to pierce the root's outer shell, but not to kill it, to pierce it. Dan asked what was inside the root. Ji-in replied that, in theory, there was a central core inside, the source, the brain. If it were destroyed, the root would cease to function, but they had to get to it. Dan assembled the device right on the roof. His hands moved quickly. Arcanite bronze, circuitry, lens, core mount. 20 minutes. Rough. No calibration, no testing. A one-shot gun. One shot. He set the device on the edge of the roof, aimed it at the root. The root was 400 meters away. Huge. It blocked the horizon. They had stopped counting its creatures. They were climbing the walls in a continuous stream. Dan inserted the core, aimed, activated the circuit. The arcanite bronze hummed. The lens lit up. The core began to release energy, all of it, at once. The beam struck, white, blinding, straight as a line on a drawing. It pierced the root's outer shell, right through, leaving a hole 2 meters in diameter. The root shuddered, froze. Through the hole, its insides were visible. Living metal, intertwined structures, and a glow in the depths. The core, the root's central core, the size of a man, pulsating. Dan activated all frequencies. He said one phrase, a hole in the root, northeast. Whoever can reach the core inside. 3 seconds of silence. Then So-Yun's voice, cold and steady. She said she was going. Amber's voice, loud and angry. She said she was going too. 2 women, 2 sets of blades made by Dan, against the root's core. So-Yun and M met at the breach. Without a word, So-Yun went first. Amber covered her. They entered the root. It was hot inside, cramped. Living metal moved around them. The root was trying to heal the wound. The walls were closing in. So-Yun slashed. The bone steel blades cut through the living metal, and it recoiled, like flesh from a burn. They fought their way to the core in 4 minutes that felt like an hour. The core hung in the center of the chamber, huge, pulsating, alive. So-Yun struck first. Her right blade entered the core. Amber struck next. Her sword sliced through the crystal from top to bottom. The core cracked. It split. The light inside went out. The root shuddered. With its whole body, all its creatures froze at once, like puppets whose strings had been cut. Then they began to fall, one after another. Hundreds of creatures collapsed to the ground, dead. The root slowly sank, like a building being demolished, slowly and heavily. It struck the ground so hard that all of Hornvale shuddered and froze. People stood on the city walls, hunters, guards, residents who had come out to watch. Silence. Complete silence. Then someone screamed, and another, and another. The screaming turned into a roar. Hornvale was screaming, not out of fear, from impossible relief. The root had attacked Hornvale, and Dan coordinated the defense from the workshop roof, controlling turrets and squads through his headset. He assembled a disposable energy cannon and blasted a hole in the root's frame, through which So-Yun and Amber slipped inside and destroyed the central core. The city was saved. The morning after the battle was quiet. Dan stood before the root's carcass. A massive hulk of dead metal and bone lay 300 meters from the northern wall. Hundreds of creature corpses lay scattered around it. The field was gray with ash and black with the blood of the broken. Dan looked at the root and listened. A quiet sound, like a whisper, coming from inside the dead machine. He stepped closer. He placed his hand on the frame. The interface unfolded, and what he saw made him freeze. The root structure was familiar, not of this world, of Pittsburgh. The frame was built on a modular assembly principle, standardized connections, unified nodes, replaceable blocks. It wasn't a living creature that had grown. It was a device that someone had designed, long ago, a very long time ago, and then it had continued to assemble itself, from everything it found, from trash, from debris, from bones and metal and waste. The root was a machine, broken, twisted, having forgotten its purpose, but a machine. Dan stepped back, sat down on the ground, took a bone tablet out of his pocket, wrote it down. Ji-Yoon approached half an hour later, sat down silently beside him. Dan showed her the interface data, described what he had seen: modular structure, standardization, a machine, not a living being. Ji-Yoon listened. Then she opened her notebook. She flipped to a page Dan hadn't seen before, an ancient text, copied from the ruins. She said she'd found it 3 months ago in the council's archives. A fragment of a record from the era before the rift. The text described a project, the creation of life from inorganic material, the magical animation of waste, a recycling through self-assembly. The ancient civilization didn't just build machines. It created machines that built themselves, from trash, from manufacturing waste, from everything left behind by their factories, workshops, and laboratories. A closed cycle. Perfect recycling. Only something went wrong. The self-assembly program continued to run after the fall of civilization. Uncontrolled, aimless, unrestricted. The machines assembled themselves from ever-new waste. They evolved, became more complex, grew larger, more aggressive. Not because they wanted to kill, because the only command left in their code was one: to collect. To collect everything, including the living, including humans. The broken weren't an invasion from outside. They were the trash of this civilization. Trash that continued to collect itself. And for 12 years, the continent waged war against its own waste. Dan sat in the ashes and looked at the dead root. Ji-yoon sat next to him, flipping through a notebook. Silence. Then Dan said that if the broken ones were machines with a self-assembly program, the program could be rewritten. Ji-yoon looked at him. She said that theoretically, yes, if they could find the source code. If they could understand the language it was written in. If they could gain access to the control point. Dan stood up. He said he knew where that point was. Ji-yoon asked how he knew. Dan replied that the voice that had transported him here had said, calibration error. Calibration is an engineering term, system adjustment. If there was a calibration error, that means there's a system somewhere that's being calibrated, and that system is under Hornwell. Because the voice brought him here, not to another enclave. Here, to this dump, near this city, beneath which lie the ruins of what was once the main research center of an ancient civilization. They went down into the underground the next day, Dan, Ji-yoon, So-yoon for cover. The entrance was found under the workshop. Dan had always known there was something under the floor. The interface showed an anomaly, an empty space. He hadn't gone in there before. There hadn't been time. Now the time had come. Beneath the workshop was a corridor, long, made of arcanite bronze. The walls were intact, not a speck of rust in centuries. They walked for 20 minutes, So-yoon in front with blades at the ready, Ji-yoon with a lantern, Dan in the center. The interface worked continuously, scanning the walls, the floor, the ceiling, every meter. The corridor led to a hall, huge, round. A panel stood in the center, ancient, made of a material Dan had never seen before. Not metal, not stone, not bone, something in between. The panel was active. Dim lights flickered on its surface. Screens, dead, except for one. A small screen in the center, text on it, in a language none of them knew. Ji-yoon leaned in. She took out a notebook. She compared the symbols to the ones she'd copied from the archives. She translated slowly, symbol by symbol. Dan waited. So-yoon stood at the entrance, listening to the silence of the dungeon. Ji-yoon finished. She looked up. She looked at Dan. She read aloud. Hello, garbage collector. Forgive us. Fix it. Dan stood in front of the ancient panel in the dungeon beneath the workshop, beneath the city he had saved, beneath the dump where he had woken up 5 months ago. And he read the words of the people who had created this world, and broken it, and waited for someone to come and fix it. They had waited 12 years, 100 years, maybe 1,000. They had waited for the scavenger, for him. So-yoon quietly asked what he was going to do. Dan didn't look away from the panel. He said he was going to do what he'd always done. Take it apart, understand it, put it back together. Ji-yoon asked if he could rewrite the Broken One's program. Dan replied that he didn't know yet, but the panel was working. The screen was lit. Somewhere in this system, there was code. And if there was code, it could be read. And if it could be read, it could be changed. He placed his hands on the panel. The interface flashed, brighter than ever. Thousands of lines of data poured forth. Blueprints, schematics, protocols. The history of an entire civilization recorded not in books, but in engineering documents. Dan read. He absorbed. He memorized. He didn't understand everything, far from everything, but he understood the main thing, the structure, the logic, the principle. It was engineering, different, alien, but engineering. And engineering obeys the same laws, whether in Pittsburgh or in the underground beneath Hornwall. Energy, mechanism, result. He stood in front of the panel for 3 hours. Then he took his hands away, turned to Ji-yoon, said he needed a year. Ji-yoon asked what for. Dan answered, to translate everything written here, to understand how the self-assembly program works, to find the entry point, to rewrite the code, and to redirect every broken one on the continent, from self-assembly to self-disassembly. Ji-yoon looked at him. Then she said quietly that it was madness. Dan replied that he heard that every day, and that he was still waiting for it to become an argument. A year passed. Dan Kai stood on the roof of the workshop and looked at Hornvale. The city had changed. The walls were intact. Soaked in bone compound, they glowed with a dim black light that never faded, day or night. No creatures were in sight, not a single one. The turrets on the towers stood silent. There was no one for them to shoot at. Kai's workshop occupied an entire block, not 3 rooms, a block. The main workshop with 4 workbenches and 2 furnaces. Ji-yoon's laboratory with the equipment she and Dan had designed together. A materials warehouse occupying a former residential building. A workshop for the younger apprentices. Grace's hospital next to the workshop, and a separate room, locked, one that only Sabrina knew about. Sabrina Vale had arrived 4 months ago, tall, graying at the temples, though she was only 30, the last survivor of the ancient order. She had wandered the continent for 10 years, searching for the armor of her fallen brothers. She didn't find them. She heard that the workshop in Hornvale restores old equipment. She came to retrieve the order's relics. Dan led her to a locked room. He opened the door. Inside stood 47 sets of armor, each on a wooden stand, each restored, each with the owner's name engraved on the inside. Based on the order's archives that Dan had found in the ruins of their headquarters a year and a half ago and had been transcribing at night. Sabrina walked in. She saw the first suit. Name, number, rank. Then the second, the third. 47 suits, 47 names, 47 of her dead brothers. She sank to her knees and didn't get up for an hour. Dan sat outside on the threshold, drinking tea. He didn't go in, because it was off limits right now. When Sabrina came out, her eyes were dry and her back was straight. She said one sentence. She said she was staying, and she stayed. From that day on, she stood behind Dan's shoulder on every operation, an adult, an equal, the only one among them all who saw in him not a genius or a master, but simply a man who fixes the world because there is no one else to do it. Golem 1 was completed 2 months ago, 3 meters tall, a skeleton made from the bones of the highest broken, armor fashioned from the gear of Sabrina's brother, Theo, the first to fall on the first day of the rift, his name on the inside of the breastplate. 4 servo motors from ancient machines, a magical circuit designed by G-In, a 5th rank core from the root. One moved, slowly, heavily, but precisely. He responded to Dan's commands, performed simple tasks, stood guard, carried loads, and it was always right behind Sabrina, because it was built from her brother, and because Dan decided so. By today, the workshop had 30 golems, of different sizes, for different purposes: combat, cargo, construction, an army of metal and bone that didn't eat, didn't sleep, and wasn't afraid. 6 top-ranking apprentices: Theo, Mina, and the 4 who came later and had grown from apprentices to masters over the course of a year. Mina exceeded expectations. Her gift had fully developed. She didn't just sense materials, she spoke with them. She'd take a piece of metal and know its history, where it was forged, who carried it, what happened to it. Dan said that in 10 years, she'd be better than him. He was wrong. In 5. Orwell Kane returned 3 months after the battle, quietly, without an army, without the guild. The Iron Fang Guild had disbanded in Greyhall. The hunters had gone their separate ways. Some returned to Hornvale, some did not. Kane returned alone, old, broken, not physically, inside. He came to the workshop and stood at the gate. Amber came out to meet him. They stood facing each other, father and daughter. He didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't demand it. He asked if he could be of use. Amber looked at Dan. Dan nodded. Kane began training the young hunters at the workshop, silently, professionally. Without his former arrogance, the war with his own demons had taught him what the war with others could not. That strength without understanding is simply destruction in a pretty package. Today was the day everything was supposed to end, or begin. Dan had spent 11 months in the dungeon beneath the workshop. Every free night, every free morning. Ji-Un by his side, always by his side. They had translated the protocols of an ancient civilization. Not all of them. Enough. The self-assembly program was simple in its essence. One cycle. Find material, analyze, integrate, repeat, endlessly, without stopping, without a goal. The stop command was hardwired into the system, but no one issued it because there was no one left to issue it. Everyone was dead, and the machines kept assembling. 12 years, 100, 1,000. Dan found an entry point into the program, found the code language, found the syntax, and wrote a new command, not a stop. He could have simply stopped them, shut them down, but that would have meant killing. Every broken on the continent, millions of beings who didn't choose to be what they became, who were trash that had learned to live. Dan didn't kill them. He wrote a different command. Disassemble. Not themselves, not each other. To disassemble what had been assembled incorrectly. To return the materials to their original state. To cleanse the earth. To restore what had been broken. To redirect the program from senseless self-assembly to meaningful recycling. The broken ones won't disappear. They will change. From creatures devouring the world, they will become machines restoring it. From trash that destroys into trash collectors who repair. Like Dan, he stood before the panel, Ji-Un beside him, So-Yun behind him. Everyone was here. Amber, Grace, Mina, Theo, Sabrina, the students, even Kane, even Goran. Everyone had come to the dungeon. Everyone wanted to see. Dan placed his hands on the panel. The interface flashed. The code was ready, verified, double-checked. Ji-Yoon confirmed the calculations. The system was ready for transmission. One command, to the entire continent, to every broken one, to every root, to every creature from the lowest to the highest rank. To dismantle what has been assembled incorrectly, to assemble what should be. Dan closed his eyes. He remembered Pittsburgh, the factory, the conveyor belt, mountains of scrap metal, refrigerators and washing machines and cars, trash that no one wanted, that he had learned to love. With a strange, quiet love, the way one loves a stranger's abandoned dog. He opened his eyes. He pressed the button. The panel flashed. A wave passed through the earth, through stone, through the concrete walls and the bones in the walls and the metal in the turrets. It passed through Hornvale, through the wastes, through the entire gray continent. Every broken on the planet stopped in that very second, froze, and began to change. Not to die, to change. Across the continent, the creatures that had been killing and destroying for 12 years began to dismantle. Not themselves, the world around them. Ruins, debris, trash. They took pieces of destroyed buildings and stacked them neatly. They took broken roads and repaired them. They took charred car wrecks and separated them into components. Metal by itself, stone by itself, wood separately. Just as Dan had taught, just as Dan had done from day one, sorting, dismantling, preparing for a new assembly. The broken had become scavengers. So-Yun stood behind Dan and looked at the panel screen. Lines of data scrolled across it. Reports from across the continent. Every broken one was connected. Everyone was running a new program. She placed a hand on his shoulder, silently. Amber stood to the right, arms crossed over her chest. Her breastplate glinted in the panel's light. She didn't say anything, but she didn't leave. Ji-Yoon sat on the floor next to the panel. Her notebook was open to the last page. There was a single symbol on the page, an ancient one, the same one as on the panel. She had translated it on the first day and hadn't told Dan. Now she told him. The symbol meant home. Grace stood by the wall. Her hands were folded. Her eyes were closed. She was praying, not according to the doctrine of the shining blade, according to her own, for her brother, for everyone who had died because the world hadn't had time to fix itself. Mina sat on the step, small, quiet, holding a piece of bone in her hands. That very one. The first one she'd called sad. Now it was warm. Theo stood next to her. He'd grown over the past year, stretched out, matured, but his eyes were the same. The boy from the dump who'd been the first to give the scavenger a bunk. Sabrina stood behind everyone, upright, in the Order's white cloak. Behind her stood Odin, a golem made of her brother's bones and armor, silent, loyal, like a memory. Dan took his hands off the panel, turned around, looked at them, at everyone, at each one. 6 women, 2 apprentices, 1 former enemy, 1 dump boss, and a workshop that started with a wheelbarrow and a bone axle and a boy who didn't know how to cry out loud. Dan said the work wasn't finished, that the broken are tearing the world apart, but someone has to put it back together. Right, according to the blueprints, with tolerances and loads and assembly instructions, and that he knows only one way to do it, one thing at a time, for a specific person, to fit their hand, to fit their pain, to fit their loss. He said that Kai's workshop is open, and that they have a lot of work. Then he turned and walked toward the stairs, upstairs, to the workbench, to the furnace, to the piles of materials waiting. So-Yun followed him. Amber followed her. Ji-Yoon picked up her notebook and ran after them. Grace opened her eyes and moved toward the exit. Mina stood up. Theo stood up. Sabrina nodded to Odin and left. Odin stepped after her. It was hard. True. They had climbed up from the dungeon into the workshop. It was dawn, the first dawn of the new world. Light streamed through the windows onto the workbench, onto the tools, onto the blueprints on the walls, onto the bone tablets with inscriptions, onto the apron that Dan had taken off the nail and put on. Charred, dirty, his. He sat down at the workbench. He picked up the first item from the pile. A fragment. The interface flashed. Dan read the specifications, set it aside, picked up the next one, read it, set it aside, picked up the third. The master was working. 6 women took their places around him. So-Yun by the wall with the blades, Amber by the furnace, Ji-In at the table with a notebook, Grace in the infirmary corner, Mina by the sorting piles, Sabrina by the door. Theo brought tea. He set the mug next to the workbench. Dan didn't notice. He looked at the scrap in his hands and saw 20 possibilities in it, and each one was for someone specific. Outside in the wastes, the former broken were sifting through the ruins, methodically, carefully, sorting, metal separately, stone separately, bone separately, just as the scavenger had taught them. The gray continent was beginning to mend itself, slowly, quietly, bolt by bolt. And Dan Kai sat at his workbench, in an apron, with black hands, with a mug of cooling tea. And he did the one thing he could do better than anyone in both worlds. He took what was broken and made it whole.